It was a series of murders that would defy human comprehension.
This is the worst case of serial killing in Australia's history.
The revelations about the case would captivate and shock the nation.
It's the stuff of horror movies.
Torture, electrocution, decapitation, and at one stage, cannibalism.
For the first time, we hear from the man who led the police investigation.
All of the barrels were full of body parts. The difficulty was, how many bodies did we have there?
And in a world exclusive, we reveal the footage taken by detectives as they entered the infamous bank vault for the first time. This is Snowtown, and the bodies in the barrels murders were crimes that shook Australia. Sometimes, the most shocking crimes can start with a less significant case, an almost inconsequential inquiry that prompts an inquisitive detective to delve a little deeper. That was certainly the case with a routine missing persons inquiry in Adelaide, which would uncover a tale of torture, cold-blooded murder, and lead to Australia's most prolific serial killer.
There was an officer in charge of the police major crime section, Paul Schramm, who instigated a system in the major crime branch that when detectives had some downtime, which was rare, they would have a look at old missing persons cases. So cases that had perhaps sat idle for a while. They're never closed, but perhaps had sat idle for a while.
I'd only just gone to major crime investigation branch, and the missing persons section came under the same branch structure. So I asked the missing persons section to choose 10 files that they thought were most worthy of a review.
The reason he did that was that people who disappear really only disappear for 3 reasons generally, and one is that they've chosen to, another is that they've taken their own life, and the third is that they've met with foul play. And when that possibility can never be discounted, then a missing persons case is always worth looking at and considering.
One of those files was a chap called Clinton Trezise.
Clinton Trezise was a down-on-his-luck young man who had spent most of his childhood in foster care. He disappeared in 1992 and wasn't reported missing for 3 years.
There wasn't really anything to go on. The usual trails had gone cold soon after his disappearance. Things like transactions in his bank account, they weren't occurring. Some of his possessions had disappeared at the time he did from his flat. A lot of people disappear in that way for whatever reason, and so it was a difficult case. While that was happening, there was another missing persons case that came to the attention of the missing persons unit, which worked side by side with the major crime branch. And that was a person called Barry Lane, who vanished and was reported missing by his family. And it became clear to the police fairly quickly that there was a link between Trezise and Lane, that they were associates.
Clinton Trezise had actually been living with Barry Lane in the early 1990s, and the pair had become close friends. Rumours swirling around Adelaide's northern suburbs even suggested there was a physical relationship between them.
Barry Lane was a bizarre, warped character. He was a pedophile. He was a predator. He had no redeeming features.
The detectives started to look into the background of those 2 people. And what we learned very early was that they were on a disability pension. their disability pension was still being drawn down at various ATMs. Traditionally, when you look at a missing persons file, if that is happening, it may indicate that the person is still alive.
Investigators searched Barry Lane's bank account, which revealed that regular withdrawals were being made. For a missing person, that was naturally suspicious, but what was more unusual was that most were being made from a service station north of Adelaide.
Surveillance cameras were installed watching that particular bank machine at that particular service station. And pretty early on, pretty soon after those cameras were installed, police were able to obtain footage of a person making withdrawals from Barry Lane's bank account. Only it wasn't Barry Lane. And so that left police with a task to determine who that was, and they were able to do that pretty quickly, and that person was Robert Wagner.
Police discovered that Wagner was a friend of Barry Lane's, and now he'd been spotted taking money from the missing man's bank account. 2 weeks later, he was seen doing the same thing again. With Lane now missing for over 6 months, police decided to follow Robert Wagner, and the trail led to the home of a man who also knew Barry Lane. His name was John Bunting.
They had been seen and were known to have frequented each other's homes, hung around in the same areas. The epicentre of that at the time was 203 Waterloo Corner Road at Salisbury North, which is where John Bunting was living with his then wife. And so the names John Bunting and Robert Wagner came up very early in those missing persons investigations.
The pieces of the jigsaw were slowly falling into place. The more police searched, the more links they found between John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and missing people in Adelaide's northern suburbs. Slowly, a sinister tale was beginning to emerge, and in November 1998, it took another ominous turn.
At about that same time, Elizabeth Hayden was reported missing.
When police visited Hayden's home looking for the missing woman, they interviewed her husband, Mark. He claimed the marriage was over and his wife had left. His statement also mentioned another man who had often visited the house, John Bunting. Suspicions of foul play had always surrounded the missing persons cases since the review had started months earlier. But now, detectives were genuinely concerned that there was much more to this than just missing people. Their worst fears were realized when they made a chance discovery at Elizabeth Hayden's home.
They learned that there'd been a four-wheel drive, a Land Cruiser, that had been parked in her driveway. Some neighbours had seen it being loaded up, and it disappeared.
The witness account described Bunting and Wagner loading garbage bags into a four-wheel drive at about the time she disappeared.
The Land Cruiser was important to our investigation because it had disappeared from Elizabeth Hayden's premises at about the same time as she'd gone missing. So it was important to find out, had she met foul play, had she been conveyed in this particular vehicle, what was the relationship with her disappearance?
The Land Cruiser represented a vital clue, the first breakthrough that would eventually lead police to the infamous bank vault and its gruesome contents.
John Bunting, Mark Hayden and Robert Wagner were all interviewed separately, and they all provided a different account as to what had happened to that Land Cruiser, where it had gone and how it had been disposed of. So that immediately rang bells with the police. It became a vehicle that we needed to urgently find.
Bunting and Wagner were soon linked to yet another missing person when the 1996 disappearance of Suzanne Allen was re-investigated. Her file was littered with connections to both men, including the two of them being spotted loading her furniture into a truck around the time she was reported missing.
Throughout the review, gradually the names John Bunting and Robert Wagner just kept coming up as police were making routine inquiries into what had happened to these people. Whether it was as someone who had known them, a friend, had lived with them, or just had made a statement about the missing person's last known movements, those names, John Bunting and Robert Wagner, kept coming up, and eventually that meant they were a focus.
By February 1999, the disappearances of Clinton Trezise, Barry Lane, Elizabeth Hayden and Suzanne Allen were all classified as major crimes. Only a few months later, a fifth name was added to the list, a former lover of Suzanne Allen called Ray Davies, who hadn't been seen since 1995. Police began to link more and more disappearances with the names Bunting and Wagner. But what detectives didn't yet realise was that a trail of missing people across Adelaide's northern suburbs would lead them 150 kilometres to an isolated country town. And Snowtown would become forever associated with one of Australia's most barbaric killers. In February 1999, detectives investigating the disappearances of 5 people were focusing their attentions on Adelaide's northern suburbs, the area where the missing people were last seen alive.
Adelaide then, as it is today, is a great place to live and do business. Great scenery, beaches, wine, second to none in the world. But like other cities, some of the lower socio-economic areas do have slightly higher unemployed youth.
There were families for whom employment was unthought of. So it wasn't a case of people wanted to get jobs and couldn't get them, but rather there were whole communities in which it was unthinkable to hold a job.
And with that, you get crime.
Detectives were beginning to strengthen the links between the 5 missing people. Many were having money taken from their bank accounts by strangers. But what was more worrying was that they were all linked to the same 2 individuals, Robert Wagner and John Bunting.
John Bunting didn't have a criminal history, nothing that was serious. There were no serious assaults or anything like that, just minor matters. Robert Wagner, the same, nothing serious.
John Bunting grew up in the suburb of Inala. His parents were good, honest people, and they loved him and they cared for him. But he showed some really concerning traits as a child from very early on, and one of those was the pleasure he used to take in killing things. It started with insects, and he'd experiment with dropping insects into different types of acids or chemicals and see how quickly they died. And as he got older, as a teenager and a young adult, he took a bit more pleasure than you would expect from killing animals and things like that. So there were some early signs that this was a fella who was definitely not right. As he grew a bit older, he also developed an interest in Nazism and white supremacy, to the point where he read a copy of Mein Kampf and upset his mum by painting a swastika on the inside of his car boot. But by his own account, he also suffered a horrible moment of sexual abuse at the hands of a brother's friend, where he was sexually assaulted, or so he would tell years later. And I think that had a significant impact on him as well.
Wagner was also sexually abused as a young man. Bunting, to some extent, also preyed on that vulnerability. Wagner was very much Bunting's henchman. He was a tall man and provided Bunting with a physical backup that he needed. He needed someone who wouldn't question him or challenge him. Wagner fulfilled that role.
As police attempted to untangle the complex web of missing people that surrounded Bunting and Wagner, their attention focused on Elizabeth Hayden. She was reported missing by her brother on the 25th of November 1998, and she hadn't been seen since.
Elizabeth Hayden was the wife of Mark Hayden. She was not a particularly intelligent person. She had endured a difficult life, and she was someone who existed at close quarters with John Bunting because he was friends with her husband, and she eventually began to irritate John Bunting. He found Elizabeth Hayden irritating, and Mark Hayden obviously developed a dislike for his wife. Mark Hayden is a down-on-your-luck kind of guy. He's a working-class person, not very intelligent at all. And Bunting, like he would with other people, would hold court with Mark Hayden, talk to him about things he'd done, boast about violent things he'd done or crimes he'd committed. And Mark Hayden was a weak and an easily led person and quickly fell under John Bunting's spell.
On the 6th of February 1999, what started as a straightforward missing persons case review was reclassified as a major crime. This meant police investigating the 5 disappearances were given more resources, and investigators stepped up the surveillance of the 2 men at the heart of the police operation.
At this stage of the investigation, we had sufficient evidence to go to a judge and to get some telephone intercepts, some listening device warrants. The detectives who were investigating the case were contacted by our surveillance section, who were surveilling Mr. Wagner and Mr. Bunting, and we found that they were heading to Snowtown.
Snowtown's a small rural community about an hour and a half north of Adelaide. Population, I think, in the low hundreds. It's probably full of mostly retirees and farmers from the surrounding district.
Now, this was the first time that Snowtown had come to our attention. We'd learned that there was a person living in Snowtown that they were visiting. So it was that time of the investigation that we thought we should pay Snowtown a visit. When the detectives arrived at Snowtown in Railway Terrace, there was a lot of cars in varying stages of disrepair in the front yard. And to their surprise, there was the missing Land Cruiser that we'd been looking for all over Australia. So that was a significant step in the investigation. Now we had a link between Bunting and Hayden and Wagner and the Land Cruiser.
The Land Cruiser found in Snowtown was last seen at Elizabeth Hayden's house in Adelaide 6 months earlier. Given that it had disappeared at the same time as her, police were keen to find out where it had been.
So we opted to go and speak to the owner of the premises, and he told them that, in fact, that person knew Mr. Bunting, Mr. Wagner, and a person called Hayden, and that, in fact, these people had rented an old bank building in Snowtown. They then told the detectives that there had been some large black barrels that had been kept in the Land Cruiser, and those large black barrels had been moved into the bank vault.
It was an old, small country bank, disused, apart from being used now for storage of old electrical items, computers and things like that were broken. So once we got in, the side door leads you into the now vacant sort of kitchen meal area of the bank. To the right of that was another door that takes you in to the area behind the bank counters. The vault door was then just to the left as you went in behind the counter. Once we got the door open, we were confronted with just a solid wall of black plastic that was sticky taped, or adhesive tape all the way around.
Now we can reveal never-before-seen footage filmed as detectives entered the infamous bank vault for the very first time.
So they undid the tape, just peered into the darkness of the vault, and they filmed 6 large black barrels, packets of rubber gloves, some bottles of acid.
It was my first week on call, and I received a phone call from a major crime police officer who said, "Evening, Doc. I'm in a little place called Snowtown in a bank vault. It's lined by plastic and there are all these barrels." And so I said, "Well, is it hydroponic or drugs or something?" He said, "No, it doesn't smell like that." And then he said, "What would you like to do?" And I said, "Well, I don't know, why don't you just open a barrel and have a look and phone me with the results?"
When I took the lid off the first barrel, I could see what appeared to be a mummified foot that was sort of sticking up. I could see the sole of the foot. There was dirty clothing and a hunched up item sort of filling 3/4 of this barrel.
And about 5 minutes later, he phoned back and said there are human remains in them.
I think at that stage we were all shocked. We knew as the case was developing that it was more probable that we were dealing with a homicide investigation, but it wasn't until we saw what was in the barrels as to it was definitely a murder investigation. We could see that there were body parts, and as the other lids were lifted off of the barrels, all of the barrels were full of body parts. The difficulty was, how many bodies did we have there?
Police in South Australia had made a gruesome discovery inside a bank vault in Snowtown, 150 kilometres north of Adelaide. In May 1999, 6 barrels containing a number of body parts were found, and police realised that a missing persons investigation, which had begun 2 years earlier, may well have just ended inside the disused bank.
Firstly, we didn't know how many bodies were there. We could see that there were a lot of body parts, so we knew it was going to be a complex job for the forensic pathologists to literally piece it together. We also wanted to know who these people were. Were they the missing people who had already been reported, or were there other people who in fact had never been reported missing?
As the forensic team got to work, detectives arrested John Bunting, Robert Wagner and Mark Hayden, the men linked to all the missing people. All 3 refused to say anything to the arresting officers. Immediately after the arrests, a press conference prompted phone calls into the police department.
We received a lot of calls from Crime Stoppers, but one in particular was of particular interest. And that call basically said, "We think that you should go out to Salisbury North to a particular address because we think that you'll find a body out there." We used ground penetrating radar, which told us whether or not soil had been disturbed. And under a tank stand, we found such a place. So we commenced to dig there, and about 1 metre down, we discovered a number of plastic bags, which we subsequently learned to be the remains of Susan Allen.
Only hours later, yet another body was found at the address in Salisbury North. The skeletal remains of Ray Davies, who'd been missing since 1995, were found buried in a disused cellar, and the name of the last known resident at the address came as no surprise to the police.
The address where the bodies were found, Ray Davies and Susan Allen, was where John Bunting had been living.
As investigations continued at the house in Salisbury North, the police forensic teams carried on the grim task of determining who was contained inside the barrels retrieved from the Snowtown bank vault.
So one by one, we brought the bodies, still in the barrels, into the mortuary and took the lid off, and then we decanted the fluid, which left the remains. And then we basically just reached in and took the bodies and the body parts out. It was like a grotesque jigsaw puzzle in a way. They had used acid to try and dissolve the bodies, but you need a lot of acid to dissolve bodies. And bodies have a tremendous percentage of water content, and so the water really neutralised the acid. So the bodies were just sitting in this almost sterile, oxygen-deprived environment, and that's why we could actually get some identification. There were tattoos present, there were fingerprints still that could be taken, and also we could see some of the methods that it used to kill these victims. We had 3 cases that had ropes around their neck, and so that suggests that they were strangled with the ropes. They also had gags. There was also evidence of maltreatment. One of the victims had handcuffs still on. There were some thumb cuffs present in the barrel with him. One of the victims certainly had burns across the chest, and a couple of them had blackened areas, I think one on the scrotum and one on the feet, that could have been from burns as well.
What had begun as an investigation into 5 missing people had turned into a multiple murder inquiry. Police had already established that 2 of the 5 were dead. With the 3 remaining individuals still unaccounted for, detectives were shocked when the forensic team reported there were actually 8 bodies contained in the barrels. Were the 3 missing people among them? And if so, who were the others? Just days after the arrests of the 3 suspects, Robert Wagner, John Bunting and Mark Hayden, detectives would find out the answer.
We'd become aware in the investigation up to this point in time that there was a young man called Jamie Vlasakis, who was an associate of the other offenders.
The identity of Jamie Vlasakis is still protected by a court-issued suppression order.
Jamie Vlasakis, like a lot of people in this story, was a person who endured a horrific childhood. He was a young man who was born into a troubled family, whose father sexually abused him and then died when he was very young.
At that point in his life, John Bunting walked in. John Bunting became a huge part of his life. He became the father he never had.
Like so many other people that John Bunting exerted influence over, he was a shining light. He was a way out. He was a rescuer, a white knight, if you like. And that was the dynamic early on between them.
So Jamie Vlasakis was right there, watching and listening as these events started to unfold. And as he grew older and became more useful, John Bunting involved him in his crimes.
Over the course of several interviews, culminating in a 2,000-page statement, Vlasakis would recount a tale of death and destruction spanning almost 8 years. He would also go on to implicate someone else in the killings, himself.
With that knowledge, and under the weight of guilt and shame and despair, he began detailing what he knew about all of the murders that predated his involvement, and then all of the murders that he took part in or was a witness to in some way. And what that did was provide police with a roadmap to this entire series of crimes.
His statement would form the basis of the biggest criminal investigation in Australian history. From the first murder until the last, Vlasakis laid out who the victims were and how and why they had died, starting with Bunting's first victim, Clinton Trezise.
Clinton Trezise was murdered by John Bunting. He was attacked inside John Bunting's house at Salisbury North. He was knocked down and he was attacked with a hammer and he had his skull caved in.
Ray Davies, found buried in the garden of Bunting's house, was murdered in 1995 because he was suspected of abusing children. It emerged that Vlasakis' mother had helped in the killing. Suzanne Allen, also found buried at the house, died a year later. Bunting and Wagner admitted cutting up her body. Vlasakis could also put names to the bodies found in the barrels. To the shock of the detectives, those names included the killer's own family members.
There was a suggestion by Jamie Vlasakis that his brother Troy Yude had molested him when he was young, and that angered John Bunting. He was at home, he was in his bedroom, when Bunting, Wagner Vlasakis and Hayden all turned up at the house, and then took him into the bathroom where he endured horrific acts of torture, burns, toes crushed with pliers, and was eventually murdered in there.
As the horrific tale unfolded, the scale of depravity got worse. Fred Brooks vanished in September 1998. His mother had had a relationship with Bunting, and he wrongly suspected that Fred was a paedophile.
The murder of Fred Brooks was truly horrific. It was very possibly one of, if not the most horrific of all of these crimes. He endured unspeakable acts of torture before he was finally murdered. He was burnt with cigarettes, he had his toes crushed with pliers, he even had a lit sparkler forced down the eye of the penis, and he was restrained as it burned down towards his own flesh. It was a truly horrific, enduring moment of torture, and so when he was finally murdered, it was probably some point of relief for a young man who must have known that he was going to die.
Friends, too, died at the hands of the cold-blooded killers. Michael Gardiner died in September 1997 because Robert Wagner found his homosexuality offensive. Gavin Porter, an acquaintance of Jamie Vlasakis, was strangled to death in April 1998 because his drug addiction meant Bunting deemed him a waste. Gary O'Dwyer was targeted in October 1998, simply because Bunting said it had been a while since he'd killed anyone. There was also a sense that people were murdered as the killers covered their tracks, or they had simply outlived their usefulness.
Barry Lane was a known pedophile. I think it was because of that background that made Lane a target for Bunting.
Bunting knew what Barry Lane was, in his own mind, right from the start. But he tolerated Barry Lane because he wanted information from him about other people he knew, other pedophiles, people that Bunting wanted to pinpoint, punish, maybe even kill. So John Bunting used Barry Lane for information, and when he was done, or when he could no longer tolerate Barry Lane, he killed him. Thomas Trevelyan was involved in the murder of Barry Lane and helped dispose of Barry Lane's body. Thomas Trevelyan was a marked man from that point on because his behaviour was so erratic and so unstable that there was a risk that he would tell people about what had happened, and Wagner and Bunting knew that, and they killed him by hanging him to make it look like a suicide.
Elizabeth Hayden, the wife of Mark Hayden, whose disappearance ignited the investigation, was also found in Snowtown. Killed because Bunting thought she knew too much. Her death marked a slowing in the pace of the killings as the police operation intensified. Tragically, the 12th and final victim was murdered as the net closed in on the killers.
David Johnson was Jamie Vlasakis' stepbrother.
David Johnson had an interest in computers. He wanted to buy a new computer. And he was told that there was a computer for sale at Snowtown.
But that computer didn't exist. He was lured there, and when he was taken inside that bank building, he was ambushed by Robert Wagner and John Bunting.
He was tortured into giving his PIN number of his credit card. Several of the offenders were sent off to a nearby town to test whether or not the information was in fact correct. And when they returned to the vault, in fact, David Johnson had been murdered by Bunting.
Just 11 days after Johnson was killed, police entered the vault of the bank for the first time and discovered the barrels. Now, with the victims identified, for the police the question remained what could possibly have motivated these murders. The answer to that lay in the dark and twisted mind of John Bunting. John Bunting and his accomplices Robert Wagner, Mark Hayden and Jamie Vlasakis had been charged with multiple counts of murder, after police were convinced that they lay at the centre of a web of torture and sadism that had resulted in the deaths of 12 people. The question that would overshadow any trial: what could have motivated the killers?
The key to what happened with these murders is Mr. Bunting. I mean, he sits at the centre of it.
He had a hatred of people, pedophiles, homosexuals, and in fact, he was inferring that was one of the reasons as to why he was committing these murders.
Bunting held himself out as a vigilante in relation to pedophiles.
In his bedroom, for example, there on the wall there is this extraordinary plan or map with coloured wool going between all the points, and this is supposed to be the web with all of the connections between these people he's identified as paedophiles. He believes when he walks down the street that he can just see someone and know they're a child molester.
Of course, as we subsequently learned, most of the people who were victims in this horrific crime weren't in that category, and clearly that wasn't the total reason as to why Bunting was committing these murders.
As his crimes unfolded, he killed people for the sake of killing people. The first murder is a quick attack with a hammer. He caves in the skull of his victim. By the time you get to the 6th, 7th murder in this crime series, John Bunting is binding people, torturing them, crushing their toes with pliers, burning them with cigarette lighters and sparklers. John Bunting loved to inflict pain. He enjoyed torturing his victims, and it culminated in the bit that he relished the most, and that was killing them, taking their life.
But what exactly enabled John Bunting to manipulate and even encourage his associates to commit such shocking crimes?
Bunting clearly had an ability to attract certain kinds of people, to convince them, and to establish himself as a powerful leader within that group. But you've got to remember, the group that he established himself within, they're a very vulnerable bunch of people.
He surrounded himself by the weak, the vulnerable, and those who'd been abused.
People who are desperately looking for someone, really, to look after them. He's someone who takes great delight in power over other people. Not just power over his followers, but when you look at the terrible torture and killing that went on, this wasn't simple murder. These were the most dreadful, extended sessions of torture. And that's also about exerting power and control.
Police investigating the bodies in the barrels case, as it was now dubbed, had uncovered what they alleged were 12 brutal murders. Now, in December 2000, the committal hearing began. Designed to test all the evidence before trial by jury, the process would involve almost 70 witnesses.
There was an enormous amount of information, an enormous amount of evidence that we had against these offenders. Something like 2,000 witness statements, almost 5,000 exhibits.
6 months into the committal hearing, and with the whole of Australia, if not the world, watching, news broke of a dramatic development in the case. On Thursday the 19th of June 2001, Jamie Vlasakis pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and was sentenced in Adelaide Supreme Court to 26 years for his part in the killings. He accepted his punishment and went on to become the star witness against his co-accused.
Whilst we had lots of pieces of evidence, Jamie Vlasakis was the storyteller. Jamie Vlasakis could tell the story of how this could possibly happen. He put the personalities into the equation. He could tell us the whys, not just what happened, but why it happened and how this could happen. Yes, of course it was to his advantage that he assisted. Yes, it meant he got a lesser sentence. But I believe that he was also personally motivated by guilt and a desire to actually do the right thing.
After years of legal arguments, the trial of John Bunting and Robert Wagner began on the 16th of October 2002. Both men were charged with numerous counts of murder. Mark Hayden was charged with 2 counts of murder and several counts of assisting an offender. He would face trial separately.
When John Bunting and Robert Wagner stood in the dock in court, almost always, their mood and their appearance was defiant. They were not people who looked like they had any remorse in any way. They were not people who looked like they were emotionally overcome by the things that they'd done or by hearing about it again. They were defiant.
The prosecution's case was as convincing as it was shocking. Forensic evidence found in the bank placed Bunting, Wagner and Hayden inside the vault in contact with both the bodies and a variety of weapons and tools used to torture and dismember their victims. They could also prove that Bunting and Hayden had rented the bank vault, and financial records illustrated that the trio had gone to great lengths to steal their victims' money. But perhaps the most chilling evidence was found on a series of audio cassettes uncovered during the investigation.
We were partway through the trial. We had a phone call from the police saying they had something that we needed to hear.
And that was a tape recording which purported to be the voice of Susan Allen. And when that was played, it was basically saying, don't worry about me, I've found a boyfriend and I've gone overseas. And in fact, we found some witnesses later on that had listened to that tape in a telephone call, and they believed it to be the missing person. So that did influence police's belief that in fact she was still alive. We of course subsequently found out that that was part of their method of operation.
He would make them read certain things out and say certain things which were recorded, and then these were put together so as to make what appeared to be phone messages to friends and relatives from the person who was now dead.
Given their graphic nature, the audio recordings have never been publicly released.
And also, of course, he extracted information from them about their pensions and their bank cards and things like that. So there was a small element of the pragmatic thief, but a large element of the vile sadist.
During the trial, the jury had to hear about the most horrific details in terms of what happened to these victims. That involved torture, electrocution, decapitation, and at one stage, cannibalism.
It was following the final murder in this crime spree, and that was the murder of David Johnson. And Robert Wagner and John Bunting removed a portion of his flesh in the bank vault at Snowtown and took it across the road in a plastic glove to their friend's house and told him that they had some roo meat to cook. And they fried this piece of flesh in a fry pan on the stove and cut it up and served it not only to themselves but also this friend of theirs. And he ate it and they ate it, and it was a disturbing moment, but the friend didn't know what it was.
The prosecution rested their case after 174 days of arduous and extremely graphic detail. In comparison, the defence team contesting the charges took just 18 minutes. If the court or the media expected to hear any revelations from the killers themselves, they would be disappointed.
At the conclusion of the prosecution case, each of the accused were entitled to give evidence. Both elected not to give evidence and remained silent.
On Monday, the 8th of September, 2003, the jury reached their verdicts. Bunting and Wagner were found guilty on all counts, except the murder of Suzanne Allen. On that count, they couldn't reach a verdict. Bunting and Wagner claimed that she had died of natural causes and they had buried her. The evidence wasn't solid enough to prove otherwise.
The judge commented that they had been involved in killing for pleasure. There was little likelihood of their rehabilitation. So 2 of the offenders, Mr Bunting and Mr Wagner, were sentenced to life imprisonment without parole.
The jury verdicts confirm Bunting and Wagner as Australia's worst serial killers. Theirs was a remorseless and relentless campaign of murder.
In my view, Justice Martin adopted the only course that was really open to him. The crimes that were committed were so horrific, so beyond human comprehension, that these men can never be released back into the community.
Mark Hayden was eventually convicted of assisting in the murders. The jury were not satisfied that he had been involved in the murders himself, but were satisfied that he had certainly assisted in them. As a consequence, he received a sentence of 28 years.
One of the forgotten victims in the whole sordid saga is the very place that has become inextricably linked to these crimes. The reality is that an old bank in a quiet country town has now in many ways become a shrine to the victims of Australia's worst serial killer.
It's such a shame that Snowtown will always be synonymous with this horrific crime, when in fact none of the people charged ever lived there, none of the victims ever lived there, and only one of the murders was carried out in Snowtown.
It's a terrible shame that Snowtown has been labelled now with this terrible stigma attached to the Snowtown murders. It is a small rural town that already was in decline, and the people there lived quiet lives and didn't need the attention of the world that they got.
People assume that the murders occurred in Snowtown. It's very unfortunate for the small community, but Snowtown is not a good name in Australia.
This is the worst case of serial killing in Australia's history. It's one of the most abhorrent and worst crimes ever committed in this country. And it's also a case that is unique globally in the fact that it was a group of killers which also preyed on itself.
The whole thing is actually, it's the stuff of horror movies. Could something like this happen again? Well, you would hope not, but human nature being as it is, it's possible.
It was a crime that would stun the nation.
It's now 9 days since 2 teenage girls disappeared from southern New South Wales.
In my 37 years in the police force, this is probably the cruelest and most tragic murder I've had to deal with.
The disappearance of 2 schoolgirls would devastate their friends and family.
I was 17 years old when I found out, and it rocked my world.
Are you able to tell me which of the 2 girls that was?
The one with the blonde hair.
The fate of Nicole Collins and Lauren Barry, and the appalling manner of their deaths, would confound the press and public alike.
Over the next 9.5 hours, Lauren and Nicole were repeatedly raped by both men at various points.
I said, how did they die? She said, our throats cut. I said, who killed them? I killed both.
The case of the Bega schoolgirls was a crime that shook Australia. This untamed forest near the Cupra-Canberra National Park was the site of one of the most tragic, senseless crimes ever to occur in Australia. In October 1997, two young friends, 14-year-old Lauren Barry and 16-year-old Nicole Collins, were taken to the forest and brutally murdered. The events that led the two girls to that wild and remote location began on the 5th of October 1997. It was a beautiful afternoon on the Sapphire Coast in New South Wales, and a group of teenagers were camping just a few kilometres from home.
Tartha is a sleepy, tiny coastal village. The area that the girls were staying was down a dirt track. It's the type of place where you think that your kids could grow up, they could have the idyllic lifestyle.
On the day that Nicole and Lauren disappeared, we were camping in our camp spot that we would go to regularly with our horses. We'd been there for, I think, 2 days. We were just camping, doing the usual teenager thing. We had a fire, we were eating, listening to music.
These were teenagers. They were camping in a spot that was within minutes' drive of one of the parents. They were camping in a big group, there were horses. They were doing all the sorts of things teenagers should be doing, and it should have been safe.
Also at the campsite that day was Lauren's older brother, Nathan.
My sister, she was in a really tight-knit group of friends. They were into the horses and horse riding and tried to avoid me and my mates as much as possible, harassing them, as young boys do. She was my best friend, and she was very strong. She had to be, because I was always picking on her and blaming her for everything.
Nicole had actually recently broken up with her boyfriend, and she wanted to go and see him and see if they could, reconcile their relationship.
Sarah and I both had our boyfriends there, and they didn't, and they were feeling quite excluded, I think. They were talking about wanting to leave and go to our friend Michael's place, because that's where Nicole's ex-boyfriend was. So Nathan had come out to visit us that day. He'd driven out, he was older, he had his own car, he had a licence, and then he was leaving. And as he was getting into the car, I thought, quick, get up now, tell him that girls want to go with him. If you don't, you're going to regret it. But I was like, my logic brain ruled that out, like, that's stupid. What are you going to regret? Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? The urge was so strong in me to get up and tell him, wait, stop, the girls are going with you. A few hours later, it was dark, and the girls decided that they really did want to go to the party, and they were going to walk there. They had a torch, they had a bottle of Coke with some Jim Beam in it, because we were classy. And they set off walking. I never thought that they would ever actually get there, because it's a really long walk. So I thought they'll probably get to Nicole's house, which was the closest house, and go, too hard, and just sleep there.
So the last thing that I said to the girls before they left the campsite was, where are you going? Which Nicole said, I'm going to fix up my life, which obviously now, looking back, is ironic, because she never got the chance.
The two young girls set off through the forest. It would be the last time that their friends would ever see them alive. Not long after they left, Lauren's brother Nathan arrived back at the campsite. When he got there, he discovered that Lauren and Nicole were gone.
Nathan missed the girls by only a matter of minutes. When he came back that night, as he was driving in, he must have, they must have been so close.
I think it was around 10 past 10 at night. I was driving back to the campsite. Throughout my life, I've blamed myself a lot for not being there a little bit earlier, or not staying at the campsite and with, supporting them. It's pretty hard to take that I was only 10 minutes out from perhaps picking them up myself.
And it wasn't until the next morning that we realised that there was something wrong.
On the night of the 5th of October 1997, two schoolgirls, Nicole Collins and Lauren Barry, left their friends at a local campsite and headed off through the bushland towards a party a few kilometres away. It would be the last time their loved ones would see them alive.
Nicole was very outgoing and very social and gregarious, and she would just go and make friends. She always wanted to be with people and doing things and going out and having fun.
I first met Nicole when I moved to Bega from Canberra. I was in year 7 and I'd just come from a school where I was actually bullied. So I was very vulnerable and didn't have any friends, didn't know anybody, and I was just sitting at school, by myself, and Nicole came up to me and said, "I love your shirt." I was like, "Oh, okay, thank you." And from that moment on, just instantly like that, we were friends.
Lauren was much more shy. She was a lot like me. We were both introverts. We bonded, and I don't think I've ever had a friend like her that we just understood each other at some level. It was just a connection that we had, and everything that we did was funny. We were hilarious. We cracked each other up, and she was such a great girl.
The morning after the girls vanished, their friends and family began to realise something was terribly wrong.
My parents asked me where Lauren was, and I said, "Isn't she here? Hasn't she come home?" They headed this way in the evening. It was just over a kilometre from the campground, so I assumed that she would be there. So at that point it was like, okay, she's not here. Something's not right, I guess. Maybe she's at Nicole's place. So I think my parents would have rung Nicole's parents to find out if the girls were there, and obviously they weren't.
I remember her parents arriving in the car and asking us, through the window, "Have you seen the girls?" To which we replied no. They then said the girls are missing. So we immediately, assumed, oh, they're just at somebody's house. We'll have to go and check everyone's house. To which we were told that had already happened, and they'd called up a few different places and a few friends, and they were nowhere.
We assumed that they might have gotten lost walking home, but when you assume something like that, knowing them so well, it was just a hope that that's all it was. Before I knew it, basically, there was police, SES, VRA, everyone was up at our campsite within such a short amount of time. We began searching all the coastline, all the bush, all the common places that the girls would hang out or go to. Popular places that they may have been, and to no prevail. There was no sign of them.
It's now 9 days since 2 teenage girls disappeared from southern New South Wales. Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins have seemingly disappeared from a camping trip without a trace.
It's a pain that can't be described, I don't think. A total loss, emptiness. You can't get warm, you're just cold all the time because it's just a pain that is totally undescribable. Until you've been through it, you have no idea what it's like.
At this stage, we've got 2 avenues of inquiry. One is that the 2 girls have left the area voluntarily,
and secondly, that they've been forcibly taken from the area.
Going through a lot of heartache. Just don't want it back. I don't care what I have to do to get it back.
After 3 weeks of desperate searching, the only sign of the two girls was a surf jacket with a checked pattern found by a dirt track at the local rubbish tip. The jacket belonged to Lauren Barry, but initial forensic examinations provided no clues, and with little else to go on, police made the extremely difficult decision to wind down the search.
I think I went back to Sydney after 2 weeks. I was told there's nothing that could be done and I need to try and get back to work and do things. I was 17. I just did what I was told and went back to my beautiful friends and family in Sydney that looked after me over that period. And I think the police at that point, after 2.5 weeks, started to wind down the search in the area and started to change into more of a detective sort of trying to look into evidence and find out where they may have ended up.
Mark Winterflood was one of the detectives left in the area, tasked with finding any clues that might help determine the whereabouts of the two girls.
There was a number of lines of inquiry, 8 or 9 of them, and we had them all listed on a whiteboard in the meeting room. And right at the end, when people were going home, a officer from Yass, a detective from Yass, had rung through and said these two men, Camilleri and Beckett, are quite capable of abduction or kidnapping.
Camilleri and Beckett were a two-man crime wave. Camilleri was a standover man and Beckett was his lapdog. Beckett was known to sometimes sleep on the veranda out the front of Camilleri's house, waiting for him to tell him what to do. So Camilleri would send him outside and Beckett would go and sleep and wait for him there.
My first impression of Lindsay Beckett was that he was a quieter individual, easily led. He was a criminal who had 50 plus prior entries and very much out of control in the little town of Yass where they lived.
Beckett's mother had him when she was 15. He never knew his natural father. He was the child of a rape. He grew up in a really violent household. He was renowned for bar fights that he was involved in. Leslie Alfred Camilleri was a career criminal who was born in 1969 in Liverpool, Sydney. He had 146 convictions.
Both Camilleri and Beckett are heavy speed users. For people who are not familiar with speed, it's a drug which keeps you wide awake. And these guys could go 3 or 4 days without sleep, have 2 hours sleep and do it all again. That's the nature of the drug.
These two career criminals began to fall under the spotlight in connection with the disappearance of Lauren and Nicole. Having ruled out other suspects, police decided to pursue the lead, and it proved to be a wise move.
When the original team was sent home, there was this one line of inquiry left to look at Camilleri and Beckett. We then received further information from Yass that they had met with an informant, and all the information was that he'd had a conversation in a room with Camilleri and Beckett, that it was in the newspaper, and Camilleri had said words to the effect, "I bet the cops try to pin this on us." And we thought, that's a strange thing to say if you had no involvement whatsoever. So we raced up there and we decided we would interview Mr. Beckett. It was on that trip to Canberra that I was with another officer, Detective Stuart Gray, and in the early stage of the investigation, he had taken a statement from a fellow who had noticed on the hill at Evans Hill the next morning a large television set beside the road which was a light pink in colour. And then another person had also noticed it, who'd been surfing that morning, but later in the morning it had disappeared and no one could understand why. While we're on this trip to Canberra to speak to Mr. Beckett, Stuart Gray had said to me, you know, it would make sense if you're putting 2 girls in the car, you'd leave the TV out because it's just physically not space. And I really didn't think there was much in that at the time, but we sort of kept it up our sleeve.
Seated opposite us on the other side of the table is Mr. Lindsay Beckett. Lindsay, do you agree that apart from the three people I've described, there's no one else in the room?
That's correct.
And do you agree, just looking at the monitor there, it's 11:58 and a number of seconds?
Yes.
Okay.
We met Mr. Beckett and had quite a long conversation with him. He was the most relaxed person I've ever met. He actually had his feet up on the chair in the interview room as if he just didn't care. I held back the question about the television till quite near the end, and you could sense there was a change in his demeanour. He was obviously a bit uncomfortable when that came up and didn't have a good answer.
Can you recall the television being in the back seat at all at that time? Can you recall getting rid of
those bags and stuff like that?
Can you recall getting rid of the television at any time during that trip?
No.
Convinced the television may be the clue that could unlock the case, police discovered that Camilleri and Beckett had actually been given a TV as part payment for a drugs deal. They now needed to establish if that TV was the one found on the side of the road.
We went to the second-hand store, and the guy he remembered it. He pulled out all his records and went through them. And he said, here it is, here's the brand, here's the serial number, and we got the lot. I said, wow. And so I said to him, can you remember what colour it was? He says, oh, I just think it was a wood grain TV. It wasn't anything special. It was quite an old one. So that really didn't fit. So we left there and we got out of Yass heading back to Bega, probably a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. And for some reason, I'd given the dealer my business card with the mobile number. I got this mobile call from him apologising to say, listen, I forgot something which I think is really important. He said, that TV was pink. So, whoa, we stopped the car. Well, that's it. It's got to be it.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins had discovered a vital clue in the hunt for the missing schoolgirls. A pink television found by the side of a road where the girls were last seen placed Leslie Camilleri and Lindsay Beckett in the area. An interview with Beckett confirmed the police's suspicions. 4 weeks after the girls went missing, police now needed to get Camilleri's version of events, and, as luck would have it, he was already in the hands of the law. In custody for a breach of bail, Camilleri was interviewed by detectives. They applied the same technique they had used with Beckett, keeping their information about the TV to themselves until the right moment.
During the interview, Camilleri started to spin a very vague story about where they'd been and what they'd done. And then at the penultimate moment, he asked him about, and did you have a pink TV in the car? Well, Camilleri just went absolutely silent, and it was like a minute silent. He just didn't know what to do and then said, I'm not talking to you any further. After the interview, Camilleri had gone back to his cell and was banging his head against the wall crying, saying they know about the television, and had to be sedated. And it's the first time I've ever had a prison psychologist contact police to say, I think this is significant evidence that you should know.
Detectives sensed that Beckett was the weaker of the pair and their best chance to crack the case. They were right.
We got Beckett out of custody at a police centre in Canberra, got him to an interview room, and before going to the room, I'd actually obtained 2 large photos of the 2 girls. And before I even said anything, I just pulled them out of my folder and placed them right in front of him. They were big A4 pictures. And he just saw the look in his eyes and he turned them over straight away. I thought, all right, we're on. So I quietly went through the story with him that I knew, that I could show where he was, that they were involved, and that Camilleri was no longer loyal to him, and that today he had an opportunity to show us what had happened. And I said, Camilleri's going to be made this offer later today. He may choose to take us there, he may not.
At one point, Beckett left the room for a cigarette. As they discussed the progress of the interview, the key question the detectives faced was whether they'd done enough to turn their suspect. Moments later, they had their answer.
I'd barely finished speaking and Beckett came at a fast pace down the corridor, straight into the room, and said, I'll show you where they are. We unfolded a large map we had with us, and you could see him following the Monara Highway. And he went sort of across the border, past Bombala, and said, I think they're about here. And I said, you know, how did they die? And she said, throats cut. I said, who killed them? I killed both.
Beckett proceeded to give a full statement, and before long, he was taking detectives on a sinister road trip, pointing out where knives had been dumped and bloodied clothing had been burnt. Hours later, the group arrived at Fiddler's Green Creek, an isolated area of forest just over the border into Victoria. They were almost 200 kilometres from where the girls were last seen.
So we're traipsing down through quite thick bush. And as we descend into this creek, you can smell putrefying flesh. We knew we were on the right track. And we pretty well came out near this massive tree with the roots hanging out, and you could see Lauren's skeleton straight away.
This is a electronically recorded interview between Detective Sergeant Mark Winterflood and Lindsay Beckett. Just across the creek and slightly upstream, we came to an area where there's a large tree fallen across the river.
Yep.
And beneath the root section of that tree in a portion of water was what appeared to be the remains of a deceased person.
Yes.
All right.
Then I asked him, where do we find the other girl?
Only a few metres away, police discovered the remains of Nicole Collins.
You led us to an area there which we searched, and we later found what appears to be the remains of another deceased body next to a small tree.
Yep.
Okay, and you indicated that to us?
Yep.
Okay. And are you able to tell me which of the two girls that was?
The one with the blonde hair.
And spectacles?
Yeah.
Right. At the time that she died, was she wearing spectacles?
No, she didn't have them on.
All right. Do you know what happened to them?
They should have been there.
They're somewhere near there?
Yeah.
I was 17 years old when I found out, and yeah, it rocked my world. It just destroyed every little bit of security or love and knowledge I knew of the world had just been shattered. I didn't know that this sort of stuff could happen, or that there were people in the world that could do this sort of harm to others.
With Beckett's statement, the police could finally piece together what had happened to the two girls and how their young lives had been tragically cut short.
So they disappeared from the campfire and they walked down a dirt track. Lauren had a black torch and Nicole was carrying some alcohol. They wandered towards the road, and sometime around the time the dirt road met the main road, a car drove past with Camilleri and Beckett in it.
They actually stopped in the roadway. I think the girls might have been slightly on the roadway too, and are blocking access of other cars around them. And then as they get talking to the girls, they move the car off. And it was never really clear to me whether they were forced into the car or whether there was some duress involved. I suspect there was some duress involved, but for whatever reason, both girls get in the car.
If you were to ask anyone that knew these girls, they were very young girls. I still believe to this day, it doesn't matter what was said or what people may believe have happened, or you hear stories of people hitchhiking and getting into cars or being influenced to do things. They were very young. And if you ask anyone that knew them, they were very innocent, and for fear of their lives, I think is the only way they may have been coerced into the vehicle.
The mistake the two men make is that the car is full of stuff. So while they're talking to the girls and try to induce them into the car, they take this television out and put it beside the road and move clothing and other stuff into the boot. So the girls then get into this car. What they don't realise is that both doors were inoperable. And so once they were in, they were locked in.
According to Beckett's version of events, after spending some time driving around looking for a beach party, the pair asked if the girls wanted to go with them to a festival in Bega. The girls supposedly agreed, on the condition that they could tell their friends where they were.
The girls wanted to go back to their campsite. They drive along the dirt road towards White Rock, which has these sort of speed humps to stop cars going in. Camillary's car scrapes. He flies off the handle. They both produce knives, and from that point on, the girls are kidnapped. They come out of that road, go back onto the Snowy Mountains Highway, and then travel back onto into Callaroo itself, and then they turn left down a dirt road, which leads towards Bega Tip and south towards Merimbula. Now, it's my understanding that whilst on that road, they've stopped and removed both girls from the car, and they've both forcibly had sexual intercourse with each of the girls at knife point. What's interesting from that scene, and it's never completely clear to me, was that there were 2 items of clothing belonging to Lauren Barry that were left beside the road. Now, whether that was the actual scene of the sexual assault or whether that was Lauren throwing it out the window as a indicator that we've gone south, I really don't know. But nevertheless, when they were reported as missing, that was the first thing that was found, was a shirt and a jacket belonging to Lauren Barry.
Over the next 9.5 hours, Lauren and Nicole were repeatedly raped by both men at various points.
As dawn broke on the 6th of October, and following a night of the most appalling brutality, the car containing Lauren and Nicole arrived at Fiddler's Green Creek.
We tied the girls up, tied their hands up, and they went down to the river.
For the sake of the record, I'm showing Mr. Beckett 2 colour photographs of Nicole Collins and Lauren Barry.
It was her jeans.
Right.
Yeah.
Which you wrapped around their mouths?
Yeah.
Right. Did you tear them up or cut them up or something?
Les teared them off.
Right.
Both girls were then walked along a track and towards a creek bed.
Lauren Barry was tied on the ground there and fully tied, hands, feet and hog-tied behind her back. And then Beckett took Nicole Collins up a sort of a steep embankment that's about, I suppose, 10 metres away. And up the top, he tied her with her hands behind the back at a tree and her feet were tied. Camilleri leaves, instructing Beckett how to kill them. Drown this one and stab that one. Camilleri goes back to his car.
One was restrained on the ground, one was hands tied behind the back to the tree.
To the tree, yeah.
Okay. And to your knowledge, Les got to the car before anything happened, is that right?
Yes.
Right. And he'd given you instructions of what he wanted done?
Yeah.
Okay.
Beckett then drags Lauren into the creek. It's quite shallow, but at this little corner where they were, there was a very large tree that had fallen in the water with its roots exposed, and there was quite a deep sort of hollow right there. So he's dragged her in there and she's kicked and struggled and sprayed him with water.
He began to drown Lauren, who fought for her life, and stabbed her to ensure that she was dead until she stopped moving, while Nicole watched from the tree.
Then he's left there and gone up this embankment. He comes up behind Nicole, stabs her in the throat, and then she dies.
He then walked back to the car. Camilleri had returned to the car by that stage, and Camilleri asked him, "Did you see the demon? Did you feel the demon?" They got in the car. Beckett slept until they reached Canberra, where Camilleri instructed him on how to burn the ropes and the bloodied clothing, and then they went and threw the knives into Lake Burley Griffin and then went home.
With Beckett admitting his role in the murders of Lauren and Nicole, police now had to find out what part Camilleri had played in ending the girls' lives.
After the interview with Beckett, Detective Sergeant Muir, instead of coming to the scene, had gone to Goulburn Jail, to take on the interview with Camilleri. During that interview, Camilleri put forward a version of events that he had been in the car. Yes, some girls had got in, he'd fallen asleep, had no real recollection. Beckett came back to the car with blood on, etc., etc., distancing himself from anything to do with the murders.
Despite the denials, Beckett's statement was enough for police, and both men were charged with murder. But now, detectives faced another challenge: how to prove Camilleri was responsible when he wasn't even present for the killings. In August 1998, two men stood charged with the brutal murder of two young girls, Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins, who'd been abducted whilst on a camping trip with friends the previous October. The accused, Leslie Camilleri and Lindsay Beckett, had been arrested after a police operation, and Beckett was quick to confess. Camilleri, on the other hand, refused to accept any part in the crimes.
When Beckett and Camilleri came before the courts in Victoria, Beckett entered a plea of guilty, and he was dealt with before the trial of Camilleri. And I remember at the sentencing, the judge reading Nicole's death, which was horrific. And then he sort of looked at Beckett and his barrister and said, "Your client did that?" and just sort of shook his head.
Justice Vincent didn't think he'd ever heard a more terrible or moving description of the death of a person. He said Beckett was nothing more than a quite willing participant, and there was never any suggestion the girls were going to be released.
Beckett was given a 35-year minimum term, and that was also on the proviso, his agreement to give evidence against Camilleri.
Lindsay Beckett's testimony was crucial towards securing a conviction against Leslie Camilleri. It was clear that both men had taken drugs during the trip. In his defence, Camilleri's lawyer said that Camilleri had been taking heroin, that he'd either been half asleep or asleep during most of the trip, and that he had not been involved in the murders at all.
The difficulty with Camilleri's case was that he physically was not present at the murder. So the onus was on the prosecution to demonstrate the level of control that he had over Beckett, and that Beckett was acting at his behest in killing the girls. And from a legal position, that's quite a tough call.
Luckily, the prosecution could call on science to help them in the case against Camilleri. Detectives had collected the clothing belonging to Lauren Barry, found at the side of the dirt track, and sent it for analysis.
They found a tiny trace of Camilleri semen on Lauren's jacket, which absolutely sealed, his involvement in the sexual assaults and gave corroboration to Beckett's version of events.
Another chilling piece of evidence that further strengthened the case against Camilleri was found in police files.
2 weeks prior to the murder of the girls, there'd been an incident in Canberra where Camilleri and Beckett had picked up a girl who was also a speed user, and they'd all used speed together. They then went on to have her in the back seat of the same car with the doors that you couldn't open. She was then sexually assaulted at knife point and taken along various dirt roads out of Canberra. And at one point, she was quite desperate and said, "I need to go to the toilet," which was a bit of a ploy. And when they opened the door for her, she ran, and she ran and ran and ran to a wombat burrow where she hid herself. And they were searching through the bush with their knives trying to find her. She then goes to a farmhouse, makes the complaint. Police arrive, arrange for her to be forensically examined and to make a statement.
The victim of that ordeal ultimately chose not to give the police a statement, and she disappeared. Her case was shelved. That was until the Bega detectives managed to track her down and convinced her to speak to them.
Within a week, they had actually found her and committed her to a statement which read like a live enactment of what must have happened to the 2 girls.
She established their way of operating. So they had picked her up from the street. They, on her account, had sexually assaulted her, so it seemed to show that they at least had a way of operating that seemed quite similar to the way they operated in the case of the Bega schoolgirls.
Her evidence of surviving the sexual assaults and running away at knife point, in New South Wales we call it tendency evidence. In other words, the person has a propensity to do that sort of violence. So demonstrating that in Camilleri's case was compelling.
For the friends and relatives of Lauren and Nicole, the trial represented another terrible ordeal that they had to face.
I remember my father holding me back, and also a security guard behind us holding me back, and just listening to the story and someone reading out what he had done to my sister and Nicole. Every word was like a dagger in your body, and I was sort of feeling everything she went through, both the girls went through, and trying to fathom and understand what it must have been like. It just tears open the wounds even more. They hadn't even had a chance to heal.
As I stood in the witness stand, I do remember Leslie Camilleri was staring at me, and it was a horrible, horrible feeling knowing that this monster who killed my friends was metres away from me and staring at me. I do remember he would be, purposely putting his hands up and yawning so everyone in the court could see him. He had no remorse for what he'd done and for anyone else in the room.
In April 1999, after a trial lasting almost 2 months and involving over 70 witnesses, Leslie Camilleri was found guilty of the murders of Lauren Barry and Nicole Collins.
When Camilleri was found guilty, in his judgment, Judge Vincent said, "You will represent the dark in which women and children fearfully walk. Through your own acts, you have forfeited your right to ever walk among us again." It was at that point we realised he was going to be given the life sentence.
For the murders of Lauren and Nicole, Leslie Camilleri was sentenced to life in prison, and with no possibility of parole, he will die behind bars. In 2013, he was sentenced to another 28 years after admitting to the murder of teenager Prue Bird. That was in 1992, 5 years before Lauren and Nicole went missing. For his part in the Bega schoolgirl murders, Lindsay Beckett was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 35 years.
Considering what they had done to other human beings, there has to be more to I knew what capital punishment was, and I thought, well, why can't we kill these people? Get rid of them, eradicate them. We do that with animals. We're animals. If someone has done this, why can't we get rid of them? But then at the same time, there's so much love and compassion inside me. I didn't want that either. I didn't want to be like them, and I didn't know whether they deserved more or less, or what was going to happen to them in jail.
What compounds the anguish for the victims' families is the truly unbelievable timing of the crime. That the girls emerged onto the highway precisely as two of the most dangerous men imaginable were driving past. Perhaps if they'd been just 30 seconds later, they might just have continued walking. They might have gone on to live out their lives.
In my 37 years in the police force, this was probably the cruelest and most tragic murder I've had to deal with. Most of the detectives involved would have been on previous murder investigations, but what I think separated this one was that the intense cruelty of their final hours of the two girls, that they should suffer such horrific sexual experiences and then be killed so brutally, most of us on the team had daughters, and so you empathise with parents as to how, I don't know how they could ever move on from it. I don't think you could possibly.
What I'd say to them if I ever saw them again is that I'm really sorry. And that's the hardest thing for me, is the guilt. Living with the guilt that we couldn't save them. That they were in that car for so long, waiting for someone to save them. I didn't save them. Living with the guilt of that, feeling that I let them down. And it was a betrayal of sorts, that they were my friends and I couldn't help them when they needed help the most.
I find it really hard to focus on anything, even day-to-day tasks, getting out of bed and caring for my lovely family, my two young boys, because I feel very broken inside.
They will live in my heart forever. I will absolutely never forget them. Not a day goes by where I still don't think about them.
In March 2017, Nathan Barry offered to take Sarah to Fiddler's Green Creek. It was the first time she had visited the place where her friends had died.
So if you want to follow me down here, and I'll take you down to the site. Although it's what we all know, the beautiful Australian bush with all the smells and sounds and the peace and harmony of it all, it would be pretty quickly taken away if you were a young girl being forced against your will to trudge through this steep and rugged terrain, not knowing where you were going and knowing that you were being taken further and further away from the ones you love and who you knew were probably searching for you.
It's just blown me away at how dense it is, how hard it is to get here. It's not what I had in my mind. It's really given me just sort of the last puzzle piece, you know. I've seen it and I've been here now, so.
The legacy of this case will be, we need to stop victim blaming, because it's never, ever, ever the victim's fault. And that happened a lot when the girls went missing. Oh, they shouldn't have been walking along the road, they shouldn't have been hitchhiking, they shouldn't have been drinking, they shouldn't have done this, they shouldn't have done that. Well, actually get stuffed, because it's taking blame off the perpetrators and putting it on the victims. And it's making women feel like you have to be afraid all the time and you have to be careful all the time and you always have to think about what you're doing and where you're going and who's going to be with you. But we're not putting that onto the perpetrators of the crime. Like, you have to not commit crimes. You have to, when you feel the urge to rape someone, you have to stop that. And, you know, so I hope that the legacy of this will be, it's always the perpetrator's fault and never, ever the victim's fault.
I guess my message or anything I could say to everyone that's perhaps listening to this in the world, and however they're receiving it, from whatever background or race or belief or philosophy they have, is that I think we need to create more community within society, stop being so judgmental and selfish, and have gratitude for what we have. And the biggest thing is we have each other. We're all human beings and we need to turn around and hug each other a lot more regularly. That's the biggest thing. We're not hugging. We need to hug. I'm all about that. And I think there is hope for humanity, but it's a really hard thing to say when coming from what I've been through and what I continue to suffer every day.
This is the dark and intriguing story of a woman named Anu Singh, a killer whose actions in the nation's capital continue to defy any rational explanation.
You could not have written a more bizarre story.
But was this strange tale a tragic crime of passion or something more sinister?
You don't see murder very often occurring among the more privileged young people of the world.
The scene that greeted the first responders offered little in the way of explanation.
She grabbed hold of my forearm and said, "He had a lot last night."
But the terrible consequences of an unthinkable act were clear for all to see.
He took 2.5 days to die. He was tortured.
The killing of Joe Chinque by his girlfriend Anu Singh was a crime that shook Australia. In October 1997, Anu Singh was a young law student at the Australian National University. But her life was about to unravel. She would go from an intelligent, aspiring lawyer to a defendant on trial for an unusual and calculated murder.
You sit there every day watching a young woman, wondering how it was that that young woman, who's just a few years younger than me, was sitting there accused of murder. Every day, something new coming out that just left you shaking your head. You couldn't actually believe what you were hearing because it just made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up.
The journey that led to the court that day started in early 1995, when Anu Singh began a relationship with Joe Chinque.
They met in Newcastle at a night out. Joe had met her during the time she was doing her law degree. They conducted a long-distance relationship for some time, and then they made the decision that Joe would move to Canberra.
Joe Chinque was a young man from Newcastle, New South Wales. His parents, Maria and Nino, had moved from Italy and had worked hard to build a life in Australia. Growing up, Joe was a keen sportsman and successful at school.
He was very vivacious. He was full of life. He was a real extrovert. He was someone who people were drawn to because he was just such a great guy.
Everyone was hyperactive. It's probably why they bring me in so today.
He graduated from university with a degree in civil engineering and soon after got a job at a firm in his hometown.
He was always happy, always busy. He couldn't stay still. He just had to do 2 or 3 things at a time. I'm not saying this because he's not here, but he had a lot of friends, a lot of friends. He wasn't the type that would start fighting with people like that. You know, he wasn't like that. Actually, if anything, he tried to calm people down.
He never had a bad word to say about anyone, and I think that's what really magnetised him in terms of people just being drawn to him because he was essentially a good person. He wasn't someone who sought confrontation. He was always very social. He could always have a conversation with just about anyone, and I think that's why so many people just thought so much of him.
By 1996, Joe and Anu's relationship had grown into something more serious, and to their friends, the couple appeared perfectly happy together.
The impression I had with Joe and Anu and their relationship was, in the early stages, Joe was very taken by her. Initially, I think it was very physical, the attraction. Anu clearly is not a silly girl. She was studying law. I think that side of it and that academic, intelligence, I think also attracted Joe. So you combine those two things, and I think he was very taken with her. She was very dominant, she was very confident, and that's something that I think drew Joe to her like a moth to the flame.
Anu Singh and Joe Chinque had been in what seemed to everybody to be a really loving relationship. Well, certainly that Joe Chinque was in love with Anu Singh.
However, as time wore on, friends and family began to notice that the relationship was perhaps not all it seemed to be.
The first time I met Anu was at a dinner. The impression I had of her was she was a strange girl. Conversations that we had during the dinner were about the afterlife. Do you believe there's an afterlife? What exists after this world, which is all well and good, but she also spoke about things such as her previous relationship and how intense it was with her previous partner, to Joe. She said they were so close, it was almost incestuous. I didn't know how to react to that. It certainly seemed odd to me, and it was clearly odd to Joe as well, but he said nothing, but it was clear that he was uncomfortable. She just struck me as someone who was looking for a reaction, someone who liked to shock and make an impression. He really did seem dimmed by her. She was always in the foreground, leading the conversation, leading very strange discussions at times, and Joe was always in the background. And this was not the Joe that I knew, that I grew up with.
When Joe met, I call the devil because she's worse than a devil. He wasn't himself anymore. She demanded too much of him.
When I was talking with my son, she was talking somewhere else. Soon she saw my son, Joe, was talking to me, she came and grabbed Joe from his back and started to talk, kiss him, this and that. But not only once, maybe 4, 5, 6 times.
We had a lot of argument on the phone because every night Joe came back from work, I made sure that the food was on the table to eat. We sit on the table eating and talking. And she used to call 10 minutes after we eat, and he stopped eating and talked to her for 1 hour on the phone, every night. Then I started to get very upset about that. Quite a few times, I went to that phone and I said, look, we eat at 6 o'clock in this house. Can you please ring at 7? Let him eat, and then you can talk all night.
Joe changed very quickly when he started dating her, just due to her dominant personality. He either had to submit or he would never have survived 3 weeks with her. And that's what he did. I believe he changed in order to be with her because he really wanted to be with her.
With Anu studying in Canberra and Joe living over 400 kilometres away in Newcastle, the relationship was becoming strained. After months of pressure, Joe finally relented and moved to Canberra to begin a new life with his girlfriend.
We didn't want him to go there. We were so upset. We didn't want Joe to go down there. I was very angry with him. I said, why you want to live? You got your family, you got your friends, your job here.
If Joe Chinque hoped the move to the capital would appease Anu and mend their frail relationship, he was wrong. Anu's personality was becoming more and more difficult for him to deal with.
Anu Singh came across as a young woman who craved that attention from Joe, and that she was creating a drama in her own life that she could be the central character of, and Joe was feeding her need for attention. He was feeding her with compliments. He was feeding her with reassurance that as time went on, she needed more. She had to up the stakes in the drama because was Joe getting to a point where he wasn't buying into her drama anymore? Was he getting fed up with having to constantly be there to make sure she knew she was beautiful. And how many times can you say that to somebody before you get fed up with it and you get tired of it? You want someone to get help, but they won't.
Not long after moving to Canberra, it seems that Joe was beginning to question his relationship with Anu. He was growing tired of the emotional rollercoaster that was their life together, and he was making plans for a future without her.
I caught up with him probably 2 or 3 times in Canberra, and the last time I caught up with him, he had just bought himself a new car. He had a real spark in his eye over the car, but I also got a sense that maybe there was a new chapter opening up for him, that he was starting to feel more positive about things. He had made a decision that within himself that it's time for me to go. Buying the car was a part of that, and it was an expression of that, and Anu knew it. That's what I believe. And when that paradigm shift came and she understood it was coming, that's when she decided to do what she did.
Less than 3 months later, Joe Chinque would be dead. In 1997, Joe Chinque and Anu Singh were living together in a house on Antill Street in the suburbs of Canberra. What started as a fiery and passionate relationship had turned sour, largely as a result of Anu's increasingly odd behaviour, as she developed a series of bizarre obsessions with her health.
She was a very accomplished law student. She'd been an excellent student in high school and yet had laboured under a burden of mental health problems for years. Anu Singh has a history of being an attention-grabbing, attention-seeking girl at her high school, somebody who was more intent than others around her to attract attention in this way. She was focused on her physical appearance. She has a history of struggling when she left the environment of her hometown and went to university in Canberra. She had problems with eating disorder. She then developed preoccupations with her health. She began to believe that she had terrible diseases, her insides were rotting. At one point she was convinced she had AIDS. So she develops this sense of dying and falling apart, which is part of a depressive illness.
She believed that she had a debilitating disease and that Joe, because he had suggested that she take Ipecac, which was a drug that induces vomiting, that she believed that Joe had caused issues with her health.
Ipecac is a drug that helps you shed weight. At the time, Anu claimed that Joe had suggested to her that she take Ipecac because she was constantly complaining about her weight and that she was overweight. For me, this is completely and utterly incongruent with Joe. Number one, because he never took drugs, and number two, I'm sure he didn't even know what it was.
Whether she just perceived she had illnesses or whether she was deliberately faking these illnesses, I guess that only she can know that. But Anu Singh's come to a point where she felt that her life wasn't worth living, that she was going to end her life and she was going to take him with her for his part in her deteriorating health.
Whatever the reason, Anu Singh began planning the suicide pact, with her and Joe apparently ending their lives together. The first time that Joe's parents had a sense that something was terribly wrong was when Joe failed to make his regular Sunday phone call home.
I had the tea ready and we wait for him to ring. And he didn't ring. So around 5 o'clock, something like that, I rang him. And a strange voice answered the phone. I said, did I ring the wrong number? Who am I speaking to? And he said, sergeant or some police person. I said, what the police do in my son's place? He said, just a minute, please. At the same time, the police knock on our door. The police told me, can you sit down, please? I said, what's going on here? And he said, it's about your son. As soon as I said that, I started screaming, please, don't say anymore. She killed him, did she? She killed him. Straight away I knew she did kill him. I started screaming, please don't tell me it's not true. It can't be true. That's when I knew it. It was a nightmare. Hasn't stopped.
My godmother had rung my parents' place on that Sunday afternoon, which was the 26th of October 1997. She was a little cryptic. She said something had happened in Canberra to Joe, and she asked me if I could meet her there the next morning.
The first task for Joe's family and friends was to identify his body in the morgue.
They pulled back the screen, and Maria was standing next to me, and Joe was on a stainless steel bed of some sort with just a slight purple vein running down the side of his face that was never there before, quite pale, hair pulled back, bare-chested, and was dead. Maria collapsed into my arms. I had to hold her up. She literally collapsed the moment she saw him. We were there for, 10, 15 minutes. It seemed like an eternity, but it was probably 10 or 15 minutes, and she was grief-stricken, obviously.
He looked like he was asleep. How can you see a child you give birth to, you feed him, you look after him, you bring up a man? I had to put him in that hole there, and she's still alive.
We then went back to the headquarters of the Federal Police, where they started to explain what they believe had occurred. They had indicated that in a short period of time they had ascertained that Joe had not tried to commit suicide, that there had been some sort of foul play with Anu.
What Joe's family and friends were still to discover was that this was not a crime of passion. The suicide pact that Anu had been plotting had resulted in only Joe's death, and the evidence was about to reveal that it was a death that had been planned months earlier.
She's gone to the National Library, researched books on how to commit suicide. She had lessons in how to inject somebody with drugs. She had gone through friends to find drug contacts.
Perhaps the most chilling discovery the police made was that after months of preparation, Anu Singh had invited an audience. It slowly became apparent that the death of Joe Chinque was the culmination of a carefully staged drama on Antill Street, and it was Anu Singh playing the lead role.
You could not have written a more bizarre story. Who would ever imagine that it's a real life story to say someone held a number of dinner parties to farewell herself and to lead into the murder of a young man? No one could write that. If you wrote it, it wouldn't be believed.
On the night of the 20th of October 1997, Anu Singh, a bright young law student living in Canberra, arranged a dinner party at the home she shared with her boyfriend, Joe Chinque. The aim of the party was as twisted as it was horrific.
There was a general understanding among the party guests that they were going along to witness the lead up to a crime, and that this was going to be the night that Anu Singh was going to take her own life and take Joe Chinque's life in a suicide pact.
I believe there was some discussion about the reason they were there amongst some of them, but Joe was never aware of the reason for the party. He was simply attending because he lived at the house and Anu was his girlfriend. So as far as I can ascertain, he was not aware of the motive behind the party actually taking place.
Anu Singh, by this point, clearly had a reputation among her friends as creating drama. So whether they've come along to the party simply believing that it was all hype and talk and that no such thing was ever going to happen, who knows what was going through their mind.
So many people, many of whom were in fact intelligent students at one of the preeminent law schools in Australia, had gone along with her, who knew that she was at the very least planning perhaps suicide, and seemed blasé about that. They seemed, many of them, quite content to see Anu commit suicide and weren't prepared to do very much to stop her, even to talk her out of it. I think the thing that concerned us as investigators was how a culture had existed where people could actually attend a party knowing that a death was going to occur, whether it was by murder or by suicide, and how people thought that it was okay to attend a party knowing that someone was going to die.
Tragically for Jo, Anu began to carry out her plan. Following the meal, and after the guests had left, Jo was given a sedative-laced cup of coffee that rendered him helpless.
What we learned was that Jo Chinque was in fact drugged that night. He was given Rohypnol, that heroin was prepared and put into a syringe, and that night Anu Singh did in fact attempt to kill Jo. My recollection of the evidence was that the heroin was so concentrated in the syringe that it's congealed, and that she wasn't able to inject him, that it was a failed attempt.
Jo Chinque woke the next morning with little more than a severe hangover, an effect of the Rohypnol he had been unwittingly drugged with. The previous evening, Jo and Anu had been surrounded by friends at a dinner party, and all of the guests were well aware of this abhorrent plan. So why did no one intervene?
It's a startling feature of this case that it took place when many of the close associates of Anu Singh were themselves law students at the Australian National University. They weren't junior law students, they were quite advanced in their law studies.
Here are these law students involved with drug abuse, involved with a whole series of totally irresponsible activities.
It is a very disturbing aspect to this case to recognise that you could have a group of people who are very clearly knowledgeable about the law to have colluded in such a way.
You don't see murder very often occurring among the more privileged young people of the world. You see killings occurring among the dispossessed and disorganised and dim and distressed. And yeah, this was different.
And one of the biggest questions that you're left with at the end of all this is just, why did nobody stop this? Why did so many people know what was about to happen and not do anything?
Anu's alleged attempt to kill Jo with the full knowledge of the party guests had failed. Incredibly, this didn't shake Anu Singh back to reality. Instead, she prepared for a second dinner party that Friday night, where once again, Jo Chinque was drugged and then injected with not one, but 2 massive doses of heroin. Again, no one tried to stop her.
After Anu had administered what she thought was a lethal dose of heroin on the Friday night, Jo was still alive on the Saturday in bed, tossing and turning. Again on the Sunday, still alive. Clearly she hadn't achieved what she was hoping to.
Jo was desperately clinging on to life despite the massive heroin overdose he'd been given. As Anu witnessed his life slowly ebbing away, she finally reached for the phone. But the call wasn't to the emergency services.
On the 26th of October, Anu Singh calls a friend in panic. She's telling the friend over the phone that there's been an overdose. That friend says to her, "You need to call the ambulance." And Anu says, no, I can't. And the friend comes back at her and says, "You're a selfish bitch. You can't take someone's life." She tries to convince Anu to call the ambulance. She says, "If you do, you're going to have an angry boyfriend on your hands. If you don't, you're going to have a murder charge." And it was that phone call that prompted Anu Singh to finally call the ambulance. When the 000 call was played to court, I think one of the first things that Anu Singh says, fairly calmly, she indicates to the operator, "I'd like to report a potential overdose."
Yeah, could I get an ambulance, please? Well, he's not. He's vomiting everywhere. I have a person potentially overdosed on heroin.
Potentially overdosed.
Well, he's not. He's vomiting everywhere, blood and stuff.
The operator questions her, "Potential overdose? Can you tell us what you mean?" And then this wild swaying begins of her being dishonest. She gives the wrong address. She gives the wrong name. She calls herself Olivia. So she's actually impeding emergency services' attempts to get help to this man that she supposedly loves. She's screaming hysterically one second. She is talking calmly the next.
Can the police just tell me so that's fine?
Well, it's not good if he's vomiting blood.
She was swaying dramatically between expressing her love from Joe and then refusing to answer the questions.
Her unusual behaviour continued when the emergency services arrived.
It was a duplex building, so we went in the front door and called out, walked upstairs. There was one ambulance officer inside the bedroom and there was a male casualty laying on the floor and he was naked, and the ambulance officer was trying to get a line into his lungs. There was a lot of browny liquid fluid coming out of his mouth, so they were having trouble getting past all of that to get into his lungs. So he was obviously not conscious at the time, and there was no way that we were going to bring him round. The lady in the house was actually quite frantic, and she was pacing around, walking back and forward to the window, to the door, and she approached me a number of times, and one of the times she grabbed hold of my forearm and said, "He had a lot last night," and then to let go and walk back over to the window and just kept pacing around the room.
Tragically, and despite the valiant efforts of emergency services, Joe Chinque died that afternoon. The official cause of death was asphyxiation. Anu Singh was brought to the police station as officers tried to determine how this fit young man with no history of drug abuse had met his death.
I arrived at the police station, and when I saw Anu Singh, she was dressed in a flimsy white nightie. She was hot and sweaty. I remember her being clingy, sweaty, and she grabbed hold of me and held on to me. She sounded upset. She was asking what happened to Joe and these sort of questions. During this period, she still seemed restless.
As the interview progressed and police learnt more about the twisted plan Anu had hatched, more and more questions began to be raised about her story.
Talking to Anu about the suicide pact that was to occur, the question was often raised why she didn't continue through the suicide herself. Why was it only Joe? And that question remains today. And she never really answered that question. There was no real answer to it at all. There didn't appear to me anyway to be any sorrow in her voice. She was at points sobbing, but at no stage do I remember having to give her tissues or anything to wipe tears away.
Anu Singh's claim to the emergency services that Joe had died as a result of an overdose was quickly ruled out. She was charged with his murder that very same day. As detectives continued their investigation, an unexpected twist in the bizarre series of events emerged. Police began to realize that someone else could have been involved in the death of Joe Chinque. Police investigating the death of Joe Chinque were questioning his girlfriend, Anu Singh. Joe died with a huge dose of heroin found in his bloodstream, despite him having no history of drug abuse. Police were beginning to realize that Singh wasn't telling them the full story, but they also discovered that her friend Madhavi Rao was implicated in the lead-up to Joe's death.
It's been suggested that Anu's friends just didn't do enough to do something to stop her crazy plans. I formed the view that Anu had no friends, not in the real sense. She had people she knew from university, people she'd run into. Madhavi Rao was her friend in some respects, but Madhavi Rao was just her shadow. Madhavi Rao trolled around after her. She was in awe of Anu Singh. And she, too, just was swept up in the madness of what she was saying and what she was doing and planning.
We were aware that she was a very good friend of Anu Singh's at that time and had involvement in the preparation of the crime. I had been to the library with Anu Singh, had looked up how to inject heroin with other people. She'd been involved with purchasing the Rohypnol. And also her main involvement was preparing the parties, because Anu Singh at that stage really hadn't got people to come to the party. It was left to Madhavi Rao. She was the main person who got the party goers together, so to speak.
Following the police investigation, it was determined that there was sufficient evidence to charge both Anu Singh and Madhavi Rao with murder. They initially stood trial together in October 1998, but after 4 weeks, due to a legal technicality, the joint trial was abandoned. Now each woman would face a separate trial. Both exercised their right to trial by judge only.
In Canberra, it was the right of an accused to opt for a judge-only trial.
Anu Singh's personality, in some respects, was behind the decision to elect for judge-alone trial. I thought it would be very difficult to call her to give evidence in her own defence if that became necessary. She was not someone I thought a jury would find very attractive.
Anu Singh chose not to give evidence in her trial, meaning the court would not hear her version of events.
I never had a full proof of evidence from her. I had instructions in relation to aspects of the case that I particularly needed, because I needed to cross-examine witnesses and put positive propositions to them. But at no stage, my recollection is, did I have a comprehensive from start to end narrative from Anu Singh herself.
Anu Singh's mental health at the time of Joe's death dominated the trial. To what extent did it play a part in the tragic events of the 26th of October, 1997?
The Crown case against Anu Singh was that her acts were deliberate acts of murder. They were premeditated, they were cold-blooded, and that she had made a long and detailed plan with a view to bringing about the death of her partner. But when it came to the motive was a bit thin on the ground. The most they could point to in large measure was that Anu thought in some way she had been made ill by some advice that Joe had given her to take ipecac syrup. And when you started analysing the alleged motive, it fed completely and utterly into the notion that she was mentally unwell.
She had the wherewithal to procure the heroin. She had the wherewithal to procure the Rohypnol. She had the wherewithal to plan not one but 2 dinner parties. So looking at that whole assemblage, she knew that doing what she did would result in death.
There was, in my view, no doubt that this woman had a significant mental disorder, which had been troubling her on and off for a number of years. This is why they went for diminished responsibility, not for insanity. I mean, her responsibility was diminished by the depression. It wasn't removed by the depression. Yes, this woman planned and carried out a killing. Yes, this woman told other people that she was going to kill this man. So there was very clearly a knowledge of what she was doing. The diminished responsibility simply says that the nature of this disorder was one which affected her judgment and affected other aspects of her mental function.
The judge accepted the defence had established that at all relevant times Anu was suffering from an abnormality of mind. He found that she was suffering from a borderline personality disorder of a at least moderate, if not a greater extent, that she was suffering from depression, that she had an eating disorder, and all of those things meant, in his judgment, that her responsibility for the acts were very substantially diminished.
As well as trying to establish Anu Singh's mental state at the time of the killing, the court also faced another question. Just how was this tragedy allowed to happen in the first place?
There was a parade of law students from the Australian National University that came through the witness box telling how they had been invited to the party, how that it was not a secret, that it in fact was very open, that a crime would be committed. These people were questioned time and time again, why didn't you do anything about this? And I don't know that anybody ever got a satisfactory answer from any of those witnesses as to why on earth didn't anyone do anything to stop them. Anu Singh appeared to be so open about what her intentions were that it is mind-boggling that it was ever allowed to happen.
The people we interviewed that were at the dinner party, majority of them seemed very distant to their emotional attachment to the fact that there was going to be a murder or that there was going to be a death. Nowhere during that whole investigation, except for the Chinques, were there any tears shed. So of all the people we interviewed, of all the people we spoke to who had close affinity to this whole crime, my memory is that not one tear was shed by these people for Joe.
Despite numerous witnesses who gave evidence at the trial, the spotlight was never far from the accused.
One of the strongest pieces of evidence that sticks in my mind is that Anu had told people that it wouldn't be hard to convince someone that you're crazy, that she had such a good knowledge of psychiatry, that she had a good knowledge of the law, and that if she had wanted to, it wouldn't be hard to convince somebody that she was insane. We were so close to Anu Singh sitting there when confronting evidence was heard. She would put her head in her hand. You could see her shoulders shaking, and then you would see her look around and look at you as if to say, are you watching me? Can you see me crying?
On the 23rd of April, 1999, Anu Singh was found guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Justice Crispin delivered a sentence of 10 years with a non-parole period of 4 years. Given the time that she had spent behind bars during the trial, she would serve just 18 months. To the family and friends of Joe Chinque, it was a devastating outcome.
I started to cry, I want to kill her. I really want to kill her.
The moment that the verdict came down, there was an eruption. And it was Maria Chinque and it was Nino Chinque, who rarely spoke. Just spontaneous explosion of hatred aimed at Anu Singh.
I know sometimes from someone who's not used to this, they say, well, you know, she planned it, she talked about it. Clearly, this is an intentional act. Yes, it is. Clearly, there's no excuse for that. But the law says, and I think rightly, that if you're significantly mentally disordered, such that if you hadn't been mentally disordered, you almost certainly wouldn't have committed those acts, then that does diminish your responsibility.
Someone who has sat there and premeditated, planned a party, how anyone could look at those set of circumstances and judge that to be diminished responsibility is beyond me. I'm not a judge, I'm not a lawyer, but to me, that was premeditated. Is she sick in the head? Absolutely, she's sick in the head, but she knew exactly what she was doing, and given she knew what she was doing, she should pay the price.
When we heard the sentence, we thought it was a joke. 10 years and probation 4 years. Are you joking? You get for a dog, you get that long. He's a man. He was 26 years old. And he would live another 60 years for sure, and you give 4 years to her. What kind of... we scream and scream, and we couldn't believe it. And the police next to us, Harry said, that's the way it is.
What the evidence pointed to us as police was a contrived crime. She'd moved studying it, understanding it, having parties, going and having heroin shots herself to see what the reaction would be and how to deliver heroin, trying it on Joe once, then trying it again. I think the normal public would ask themselves, how could a person walk away with just 18 months real time from that crime and then continue their life while someone had lost theirs and a family had lost their son.
Following the completion of Anu Singh's trial, it was the turn of her friend and alleged accomplice, Madhavi Rao, to face justice.
She was represented by Lex Lasry QC, and Lex raised technical legal arguments why Madhavi could not be guilty as an accessory or someone involved in Anu Singh's crime, and that was successful, and she was acquitted.
The judge's explanation was that there was nothing that could actually pinpoint Madhavi Rao in the room when Anu gave Joe the fatal injection that killed him at that time. I think people were astounded, and people still are astounded. I don't know if there's more unanswered questions in relation to the trial of Madhavi Rao than there is Anu Singh. At least Anu Singh got found guilty, where this other person, where evidence had been produced that she had been with Anu Singh, that Madhavi had been helping her find material at the library, had personally bought the Rohypnol, who had went round and had spoken to people about going to the party, how that person could walk away. And I think this is part of the enigma of all of this. How does Anu Singh get found guilty, no matter what the sentence was? And how did this other person walk free?
That question is just another reason why Joe's family and friends remain so frustrated with the justice system in Australia, and why today they still struggle to deal with their loss.
The injustice that is associated to his death again overlays all this. The fact that the Chinque family feel absolutely betrayed by the justice system in Australia. The fact that there has been really nothing close to what they would call adequate justice for what she did. With Maria, what a lot of people don't realise is that she lost a child at the hands of someone she invited into her own home and embraced as potentially a daughter-in-law. She cooked for this woman, you know, an Italian woman, the way they express love is through cooking. And she sat at that very table where they still sit down every day and have their lunch, you know, and served her a meal. You know, the woman who was responsible for killing her son in the most brutal of fashions. He took 2.5 days to die. He was tortured.
When October comes, a terrible time. His birthday is worse. Nobody rings you. Either they remember or not, we don't know. You don't feel like go out. Even you see something funny, you start laughing, you stop. Because you think, no, I should not enjoy myself. I've got no right to enjoy myself. Because you think, why should I? I've got no right. It's not here anymore.
If anyone thinks they even mildly understand what she went through, think again. I would ask every mother out there to think about their firstborn son being killed by their girlfriend, a woman you invited into your own home, and taking 2 days to do it. No one can understand what she's been through. No one. I don't care what anybody says. No one can understand it.
You have to go through things like that to understand. People tell you, oh, understand. No, you don't understand until you go through. You don't know how bad it is losing a child. He was a person. He was my son, and he lived 26 and a half years, and he's not here anymore.
We believe that she actually murdered him, and she took his body somewhere we don't know exactly.
The disappearance of a marine engineer would unearth a dark tale of greed, deception and dishonesty.
He said, "I'll see you in a few months, Roscoe." And I said, "Good on you, Carl. Enjoy your time off." And that was the last time I saw Carl.
A brutal and violent crime would unravel a twisted web of lies.
There was blood spots found on the wall of the master bedroom.
We can reveal the incriminating documents discovered by police and how forensic investigators used them to track down a cold-hearted killer.
I could identify, that's a forgery, that's a forgery, that's a forgery.
The essence of the case is to identify the important pieces of the jigsaw and put them together and to produce one picture, the truth.
The case of Patricia Byers, who would become known as the Black Widow, was a crime that shook Australia. Carl Gotchins was a 51-year-old marine engineer from Yatala in Queensland. In July 1990, in the midst of relationship troubles, he was due to board a plane bound for Thailand. Almost 10 years earlier, Carl had left his first wife and their 2 daughters and started a relationship with Patricia Byers, who became his de facto partner. But by 1990, this relationship was also floundering. Carl had met a woman in Thailand, and he decided to end his relationship with Byers and move abroad to start a new life.
He'd been away on a trip. He'd returned to Harwood Island, and his employer at the time, Ross Roberts, had driven him to his house at Glen Osmond Road, Yatala.
When I dropped him home, he invited me in for a beer, but on the way to Brisbane, he had mentioned that he had been arguing a bit with Patricia, I suspect over the fact that he was going to Thailand. And I said, no, I don't think I'll come in. And that was the last time I saw Carl.
He'd booked an airfare to go to Thailand on Friday the 6th of July, and he'd arranged to meet his girlfriend, and he wasn't heard from again.
This tale of a relationship breaking down and a partner leaving for a new life is far from unusual, and the friends and colleagues of Carl Gotchins quite reasonably accepted it and got on with their own lives.
We realised Carl hadn't been there for a while. Trish said to us that he'd got involved a young lady in Thailand during his travelling, and that he decided that they'd part the ways and he would go and live there with her. We didn't think too much of it because he was away quite a lot and we hadn't any reason to, challenge or question what she said.
We all thought that Carl had just moved up into Asia to work in the marine industry, which is not unusual for people of his age or his experience. There's many, many men in particular living in Asia who are Australian marine engineers because they're very sought after because of their ability.
And that's where the tale of Carl Gotchens would end, if it wasn't for a bizarre series of events in April 1993 on the calm waters of Moreton Bay on the Queensland coast near Brisbane. By then, Gotchens hadn't been heard from in almost 3 years. Carl's former partner, Patricia Byers, had seemingly come to terms with his sudden decision to leave her, and she'd moved on with her life. Just a few months after his departure, she had begun a new relationship with fellow insurance agent John Asquith.
Patricia suggested that they go off for a romantic weekend on the boat. It was a lovely night. They had dinner on deck, they made love, they had a shower on deck together, and then they went to bed. The next thing that John Asquith knew, he woke up to discover that he'd been shot in the head. The bullet had actually, by some miracle, had actually shattered when it hit his head, and somehow it hadn't actually killed him. He couldn't see Patricia Byers anywhere, so he managed to clamber out onto the deck, and he found her there, slumped over. She said that she'd been knocked on the head and couldn't remember anything. She thought that they'd been attacked by pirates.
She had this story that they had pirates or somebody climb on board with her asleep at night and shot him, and she was drugged or she was drunk and didn't wake up.
Amazingly, John Asquith was alert enough and well enough to be able to call the Coast Guard and get help.
Local police responded to the alleged pirate attack with immediate suspicion. Whilst Asquith was lucky to be alive, medics could find nothing physically wrong with Byers, despite her claims of being attacked.
So the police obviously had to look at, what had gone on. Had there been pirates, although, Moreton Bay is not really known for piracy. Maybe it was kids hooning round, but again, there were no reports of that. So they had to look a little more closely at what had actually gone on. John Asquith claimed that he'd seen a gun below deck. But by the time the Coast Guard arrived, there was no sign of the gun. The Coast Guard actually searched overboard but couldn't find the gun anywhere. And Patricia Byers said that she hadn't seen it.
Asquith was convinced he'd seen a gun below deck, and the fact that it had now disappeared only intensified police's suspicions. Their concerns grew when they were made aware of Patricia Byers' behaviour towards her supposed lover.
Patricia Byers told John Asquith to retract his statement to police. She wanted him to lie and say he hadn't seen a gun on the boat.
Faced with a version of events that was becoming increasingly harder to believe, police decided to cast the net further in an effort to work out exactly what had happened on board the boat.
So one of the avenues of inquiry that the police did pursue was John Asquith's finances. Was there a financial motive that someone wanted him dead?
What police discovered was that Asquith had not just one life insurance policy in his name. They found there were actually 5. The first was taken out shortly after the start of their relationship. The last was dated less than a month before the ill-fated boat trip. All bore a signature that looked a little like Asquith's, but all were forged.
All of these had been taken out fairly recently, and John Asquith had no memory of having done so. So the question was, who would have had a motive to take out the life insurance policies? There were $275,000 worth of policy against John Asquith with false signatures. Someone had falsified his signature on these policies. Patricia Byers was involved in the insurance industry, and so she knew very much what she was doing when it came to things like life insurance. So looking at all the evidence the police had uncovered, it was pointing very clearly in the direction of one person, and that person was Patricia Byers.
This shocking turn of events confounded police, but their suspicions were confirmed when a chance discovery in a nearby river sealed Byers' fate.
Well, actually, my son had been down to the riverbank fishing with his mates. They'd found this rifle butt. Then subsequently, they sent divers in and they found the rifle barrel in the river, which is stuck in the mud. And they put two and two together and said, obviously, a rifle had been sawn off.
Prompted by the ongoing investigation into Byers, forensic officers attempted to link the remains of the gun to their suspect.
And through some amazing investigative work, detectives were actually able to match the pieces of the gun that were found in the river with some shavings, wood shavings, that were found in the basement in a vice in the workshop at Patricia Byers' house. Forensics used that evidence to prove that it was the same gun that came from Patricia Byers' house that was used to shoot John Asquith.
With this piece of the puzzle, detectives could finally prove what had happened on board the boat that April night.
In reality, what had happened is that she and John Asquith had sexual intercourse, he went to sleep, and then she shot him. But the big mistake that she made is, well, first of all, she shot him at close range, but she shot him with a sawn-off gun. And the problem with that is that the muzzle velocity is a lot less than if she hadn't sawn it off. And luckily for John Asquith, he seems to have had a thick skull, and the bullet did not penetrate his skull.
Byers was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of John Asquith. In September 1994, she was found guilty and eventually sentenced to 12 years in prison.
John Asquith sat in the Supreme Court to see the woman he once loved sent to jail.
Just relieved that it's all over.
Her motive for shooting him was $270,000 from 5 life insurance policies she'd forged in his name. Byers testified that Asquith had actually shot himself as part of a conspiracy by the couple to defraud the insurers. The jury didn't buy the story.
With a cold, calculating woman behind bars, police closed the case on Patricia Byers. That was until the publicity surrounding the trial prompted the family of a man who hadn't been heard of for 4 years to contact the police.
When we saw the article in the paper in regards to the attempted murder of John Asquith, we finally had some sort of clue to go on about my father's whereabouts. We just thought the worst had happened to him.
After the conviction of Patricia Byers for the attempted murder of John Asquith, by happen chance, police had come into possession of knowledge or information that Patricia Byers had been living in the residence of a gentleman by the name of Carl Gottschens.
Some years earlier, Carl Gottschens' family had actually contacted Patricia Byers to ask where he was, as they hadn't heard from him for some time. Byers told them that they had separated and he was now living in Thailand. His family took this at face value until the news broke about John Asquith's attempted murder.
Even though he didn't have a lot of contact with his family, it was out of character that there'd been no contact for 4 years. There was no reasonable explanation as to why this man basically disappeared off the face of the earth.
"51-year-old Carl Gottschens disappeared from Queensland in July 1990. Amid rumours of a new life in Thailand, his friends, family and colleagues were all led to believe that he had moved abroad. 4 years later, Carl's ex-partner Patricia Byers had been convicted of attempting to murder another former lover, John Asquith. in an attempt to cash in numerous life insurance policies. Inevitably, Carl's family and friends began to worry that he had met a similar fate.
Carl was the sort of fellow that I warmed to rather quickly. He was a very good engineer, good sense of humour, and wasn't frightened to speak his mind.
Carl was a very pleasant fella, very serious sort of man, I would say. We didn't see a lot of him, a lot more probably of Trish than we did of Carl, because he was away a lot of the time. He wasn't on the scene. We didn't worry too much about it, because he was away for weeks on end and a couple of months on end sometimes.
Carl had been married before, and he and his wife had 2 daughters. Although the relationship had broken down, he kept in touch with his children. Shortly after the marriage breakup, Carl met Patricia Byers and fell in love.
So Patricia Byers was an insurance agent. She was married before when she was 19, and her first husband died, so she was a single mother with 2 children.
Although life as a single mother was difficult, she refused to let it get the better of her, and she began a successful career in insurance.
Trish was very sort of outgoing, but she was probably more interested in being with the men because she had more in common with them. She didn't see herself as a homebody. She's very interested in being out in the yard, doing the manly things like brush cutting and mowing and laying walls and things like that, you know.
So Carl Gotchins and Patricia Byers met at a sailing club. They were both very keen sailors. And Patricia, they built up a business together. They were in a de facto relationship together. They shared a house.
We built the house in '88, the same time as Patricia Byers was building their house with Carl. We sort of got friendly as the house was being built. As a neighbour, Patricia was very, very good. We had no problems with her at all. She was quite helpful. We did socialise them a little bit. Didn't go much further than that, but we did have a couple of barbecues and we found them very sociable.
First time that I met Patricia Byers was she came to the ship with Carl to drop him off, and we actually went out to dinner. I found her a very pleasant person. I didn't sense any problem between them.
But by July 1990, Carl Gotchins had decided the relationship had run its course, and he was planning to leave Patricia Byers.
Their relationship started to break down, and he was out of the country at sea quite a lot of the time. And I think it was on one of those trips overseas, he was actually in Singapore working as an engineer when he actually met and fell in love with an Asian woman.
Carl was due to board a plane bound for Thailand, but he didn't make the flight. The 51-year-old marine engineer hasn't been seen since.
So when Carl Gotchins left Patricia Byers, it came as a bit of a shock to everyone. Patricia Byers told people that he'd gone off to be with this other woman and that he was going to be on a boat and sailing. And Carl Gotchins' ex-wife and children weren't able to get in touch with him. He obviously hadn't contacted them, even though he usually rang the daughters for their birthdays. So no one had actually heard from him for a long time.
Prompted by the Asquith trial, Carl's family reported him missing to the police, who immediately became suspicious and started delving into the lives of Carl and Patricia. It wasn't long before a dark and twisted picture began to emerge. It portrayed a woman whose greed would lead her to commit an unthinkable act. The first clue that would unravel the mystery of Carl's disappearance arrived in the form of a letter, seemingly written by the man himself.
Ross Roberts, who was Mr Gotch's employer, had a number of letters that he'd received purporting to be written by Mr Gotchins. One of those was a typewritten letter.
And the letter was basically saying that he was moving on, he was going to work up in Asia, he'd been paid out some money for his house, and thanks very much and see you later.
Dear Ross, I would like to hand in my resignation. Ross, I hope you will have time to find someone else. An opportunity has come up in Southeast Asia and I feel I have to take it.
This struck me as very strange because we'd never had this conversation.
This opportunity was too good to miss. One of the partners died and it had to be quick. I was also lucky Trish paid me the money all up front in cash. She's been terrific, and maybe I've made a bad decision. I feel bad, but she is smart and good looking. I can't see her being left on the shelf. I wish you all the best. Give my regards to everyone. I will keep in touch. Regards, Carl.
To all who knew the missing marine engineer, the plans he'd laid out in the letter seemed completely out of character.
The next step in the investigation was contacting Department of Immigration to find out if he had left the country. On the 6th of July 1990, he never made that Thai Airways flight.
One of the first things they did was to contact his Thai girlfriend, and she actually said that she'd had a phone call from an Australian woman saying that there'd been an incident and Carl Gotchins would not be joining her in Thailand after all.
There was no evidence that Mr. Gotchins had ever left Australia, and there was no reasonable explanation as to why he had disappeared.
At the same time, police were beginning to intensify their investigations into Carl's finances.
We looked at his assets. He had a house at 25 Glen Osmond Road, Yatala, and we discovered that 3 weeks after he disappeared, the house was transferred to Patricia Byers' name. Bank accounts that he had in his name were activated. There was numerous cheques written on those accounts.
The more police investigated, the more they grew concerned for Carl's well-being. To detectives, the inevitable conclusion was that he had met with foul play. At the same time, one person was becoming the prime suspect. What police didn't yet have was a motive, but that was to change when a letter to Patricia Byers was discovered.
Prior to the disappearance of Mr. Gotchins, he had consulted his solicitor in relation to the separation from Patricia Byers. And there is a letter from his solicitor addressed to Patricia Byers, which states, "Our client instructs that the relationship between the two of you has broken down and the relationship which began in 1981 has now ended. Mr. Gotchins is hopeful that the relationship will end on an amicable basis, and the purpose of this letter is to set out our client's proposal."
This letter obviously unnerved Byers. In an attempt to find out how the breakup would affect her financially, she forged Carl's signature on a letter, securing access to his will.
Byers also knew that if Carl Gotchins simply died in an unfortunate accident, that she had to share Carl Gotchins' estate with his two daughters, and that wasn't enough for her.
So if Patricia Byers stayed with Carl Gotchins, she'd still get to enjoy the house, the lovely house, the boat, the car, all the trappings of a good life. If he died, she'd only get a fraction of the assets, the rest will go to the daughters. And of course, if he ran off with another woman, she'd be left with absolutely nothing at all.
At some point, she decided that Carl Gotchins had to disappear. The idea being he simply disappears, no one knows he's dead, and then she can use the opportunity then to transfer all the assets into her own name.
To the police, it seemed that Byers had motive enough to kill Carl, but they still needed proof, and so began months of painstaking work. While they may not have had a body, what they did have was a trail of paperwork that they hoped would lead all the way to the Supreme Court. Police investigating the whereabouts of marine engineer Carl Gotchins were growing increasingly convinced that his ex-partner Patricia Byers was responsible for his disappearance. They had evidence that his assets had been transferred to Byers and money had been taken from his bank account. Her claim that he had left the country for a new life overseas was also quickly proved to be false. Although they suspected Gotchins had met with foul play, police were lacking one thing: a body.
If there's no body, there are essentially two things that are central to the case. One, prove they are dead, as opposed to simply disappeared. And 2, then you have to prove that they have been killed at the hands of a particular person.
From the outset, detectives began to discover evidence that pointed to Byers' involvement in the mysterious disappearance of Carl Gotchins.
When you look at the facts of the case, Ross Roberts dropped him at his home on Tuesday night, the 3rd of July 90. He'd made a booking to fly to Bangkok on Friday, the 6th of July 1990. He never made that flight. Several weeks later, his house that he owned at Yatala was transferred to Patricia Byers' name. Accounts that he operated at a number of banks and a credit account that he had with American Express was activated. There was numerous transactions on those accounts. At the beginning of the investigation, the only suspect was Patricia Byers.
Now, the question for police was whether they could build a case strong enough to convince a jury that their suspect was in fact guilty of murder. Byers was still in prison, following her conviction for the attempted murder of John Asquith, and she wasn't saying anything about Carl's whereabouts.
The investigation had come to a point where I thought it was necessary to execute a search warrant at Mr. Gotchin's house at Yatala. Because we didn't have a body, there was the option that we might have to dig up the yard or search various places at the house.
There was some concreting done in the months following the disappearance of Carl Gotchins. The police did an examination of the house and the grounds and did not find the body.
And so began months of forensic investigation. They may have had no body, but what police did have were files of paperwork. These are some of the actual documents they discovered, revealed here for the first time, and they pointed to a chilling conclusion.
When I did a search warrant at 25 Glen Osmond Road, Yatala, there was a portable typewriter located at the address.
Investigators were already aware of the letter received by Carl's former boss that aroused suspicion. Was there a chance that it could have been written on this typewriter?
My examinations revealed that the typewritten letters were typed on this cheap manual portable typewriter. And there are a number of identifying features that, in my view, could say that that typewriter was responsible and no other typewriter.
The letter was purported to have been sent from Darwin, so it was odd that he's typewritten a letter in Darwin and the typewriter was found at his old address in Yatala.
By proving the letters had been typed on the typewriter found at Byers' home, detectives now had a forensic link between their suspect and the suspicious documents.
In effect, by that evidence, we could show that Patricia Byers was creating false leads or false trails to try and cover her tracks.
Spurred on by this discovery, detectives dove headlong into the financial affairs of Carl Gotchins.
The reason we went down the road of looking at his financial history was because when you look at the attempted murder of John Asquith, there was a financial element to that investigation. Investigators discovered that beneficiaries had been changed on life insurance policies and there were further life insurance policies that Mr. Asquith was unaware of. So it was a natural progression that we would look at Mr. Gotchin's financials. We got statements from his employer, statements from financial institutions. For a number of cheques that she'd wrote, we got statements from people that she dealt with, and it all led to Patricia Byers.
It was one of the biggest document examination cases in the criminal courts in Queensland, up to then and even since then. The forged documentation was used to transfer all of the assets of Carl Gotchins into the hands of Patricia Byers. That was the core part of the case.
One of the first tasks for police was to source documents that contained Carl Gotchin's authentic signatures. Once they had those, they then began comparing them to hundreds of documents that were flooding into the investigation.
In a lot of cases of forgery, forgers go about different methods. They use tracing lines or guidelines. or they use what we call simulations. They sit there and practice as best they can, using their own handwriting skills to imitate what the genuine signature looks like. Successful forgery, to beat a handwriting expert, is very difficult. As things progressed in that investigation, I became extremely familiar with Patricia Byers' handwriting and the way she forged Carl Godson's signature. When Detective Rosemary Walker was bringing documents to me, I would immediately, based on my experience and knowledge of Carl Godson's signature, that I could identify, that's a forgery, that's a forgery, that's a forgery. It's fair enough to say that she milked Carl Godson's accounts by forging his signatures on his bank accounts and using his American Express card. But the really hurtful thing was she forged his signature on the title to his property, transferring the title to her. So, from the way I see it, her motive was greed.
The final clue that brought Patricia Byers' house of lies and deception tumbling down was forensic evidence found here in her home.
They found droplets of dried blood on the wall. After all those years, very small and only a few. But the important thing was when the DNA extracted from those droplets was compared with the DNA of Carl Godson's daughters, those dried spots of blood were consistent with coming from Carl Godson's. That combines well with the fact that Byers ordered a new bed within a day of the date that the murder probably happened. And obviously, why do you order a new bed? Because the old one is covered in blood.
Frustratingly for the police, the search of the house in Yatala failed to provide any clues as to the location of Carl's body. But despite this, the strength of evidence they did have was enough for the detectives.
She was removed from Brisbane Women's Correctional Centre to come to the Watch House, where I formally charged her with the murder of Carl Godson's.
The trial of Patricia Byers began in 1999 and lasted for 6 weeks. Prosecutors alleged that Carl Godson's was murdered between the 3rd and the 7th of July, 1990. Byers had cruelly but effectively hidden his death from his loved ones for almost a decade.
There was about 100 witnesses called for the trial, and each of them came along and gave evidence of their involvement in the case, from the family to the forensic experts, to his work colleagues, to Commonwealth agencies such as immigration.
You see, the problem for Patricia Byers was that to produce the story that Carl Godson's had simply left her and gone overseas, she had to tell different stories to different people. The problem for her was that when you put all those stories together in the one room, it's very clear that she's not telling the truth. I said to the jury that there were a number of forces at work. Greed, jealousy, bitterness. But on reflection, there's something else at work there that's revealed in the forged letter that she sent to Carl Godson's employer, where words to the effect of, "I might have made a mistake in leaving her, but she's smart, and I can't see her being left on the shelf." And one can't help but think that way of thinking is part of the reason for her bitterness and an element in the murder.
I find the letter to be quite self-serving in that Trish has described herself as being smart and good looking. I can't see her being left on the shelf. Yeah. I thought it was telling.
Despite protesting her innocence to the end, In 1999, Patricia Byers was found guilty of murdering Carl Gotchens and jailed for life by the Supreme Court in Brisbane. The jury were only told about her previous attempted murder conviction after she was sentenced. Carl Gotchens' body was never recovered. The sole clue to his final resting place comes, oddly enough, from Byers' own hand.
I located a 1990 diary which had been kept by Patricia Byers. On the 6th of July 1990, she made an entry that Carl had left and she'd dropped him into the city.
And the note's interesting. She says, Carl left. And then she's got, dropped him in the city, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. Drop him in the city is obviously code, particularly when you take into account the exclamation marks. Does it mean that she dropped him in the bay? Perhaps does the city actually have some meaning to her as some spot in the bay?
Other than this vague reference, Byers revealed nothing about what happened to Carl Gotchens. That was until 2016, when she claimed she was ready to reveal everything. Patricia Byers earned herself the nickname the Black Widow after being convicted of murdering partner Carl Gotchens and the attempted murder of another lover, John Asquith. She had effectively asset-stripped both men using deception and forgery. While Asquith survived the attempt on his life, Gotchens was never found, and Byers seemed content to take the truth to her grave until events in 2016 changed everything.
I find it very hard to imagine how someone could be so self-centred and so focused on money and so completely cold-hearted in getting rid of partners for cash. It's a frightening thing, and I think everyone is fascinated by the idea that someone who looks so normal could be a stone-cold killer at heart. Patricia Byers was in prison in Queensland for some years, but in 2009 she actually transferred to a prison in South Australia so that she could be closer to her son. Now, the interesting thing about that is in South Australia they have a law, no body, no parole.
The no body, no parole law is a South Australian law. It was brought into South Australia in early 2016. Queensland doesn't have no body, no parole. However, it applied to Patricia because she was domiciled in South Australia.
The fact that Patricia Byers transferred interstate to South Australia, where they enacted the no body, no parole legislation, has meant that she's had to admit to the murder of Carl Gotchens and provide an explanation as to where his body is.
Patricia Byers, in another twist in this very bizarre case, actually stepped forward and said, OK, I did do it. You know, I did murder Carl Gotchens. And this is a woman who had denied it vehemently and has always said, no, I had nothing to do with his death. Now, purely because of the parole laws, she has come forward and said, yes, finally, I did do it. And please let me out.
As a result of getting the request, Detective Scott Chapman went to South Australia and interviewed Patricia Byers.
She presented as a lady in her late 60s, early 70s. She was quite frail and also softly spoken. She agreed to participate in the interview, however, did not agree to it being recorded at that time.
Over the next few hours, Byers told her version of what had happened to Carl Gotchens.
She stated that she received a phone call from Carl Gotchens, who wanted to meet her at the Beanley rum distillery. She said it was about 5:30, 6 o'clock at night. She arrived there. She had a conversation with Carl, and they decided to grab a 6-pack of beer and walk down to a wharf that was on the Logan River. Upon getting to the wharf, Patricia stated that her conversation with Carl became heated and she became very frustrated and very angry. She decided to walk away from the conversation. She returned to her car and she said there she went to the passenger side and removed a machete that she had underneath the passenger seat. At this time, Carl was sitting with his legs hanging over the edge of the wharf and looking out onto the river. She said she approached Carl from behind with the machete in her left hand and struck him on the back of the head. However, she stated she used the blunt side or the back side of the machete. She stated she didn't want to cut him and that she just wanted him gone. She said upon striking Carl, Carl fell into the Logan River, falling about 4 to 5 feet into the water below. She said she looked over the edge and Carl went under and never resurfaced.
After comparing her version of events with the evidence found during the murder trial, it was clear to detectives that Byers' story simply didn't ring true.
The scenario that was provided doesn't make sense. He was dropped at home on the Tuesday night. He didn't make the plane on the Friday afternoon. There was staining on the master bedroom floor which had been painted over. There was blood spots found on the wall of the master bedroom. That week there was a new bed that was delivered. So the scenario doesn't fit in with the facts.
My view is that it is unlikely that the body of Carl Gotchins is in the Logan River for the simple reason that it's a narrow body of water. It would be, quite frankly, a stupid place to dump the body because the body could easily be discovered.
Patricia advised us she was telling us the truth and that she believed that DNA was in its infancy back then and that she believed the case had been somewhat fabricated. I think it's a convenient answer for someone who doesn't want to disclose what's really occurred.
It doesn't make sense what she has said. It doesn't fit in with the facts. I don't understand why she just doesn't tell the truth.
Our suggestion back to South Australia in a nutshell has that she has not been truthful. With our investigators, with Detective Scott Chapman, she was not truthful with what we knew of the investigation, what we were able to prove forensically. That'll now be something that the South Australian Parole Board would have to consider. Only Patricia Byers would be able to tell us where Carl Gotchins could be, and we do not believe she's been honest with us up to this stage.
The location of Carl Gotchins' body remains a mystery. What is more apparent is exactly how Patricia Byers is viewed by those involved in her case.
I think Patricia Byers is a cold-blooded killer. While she's admitted to murdering Carl Gotchins, she hasn't admitted to murdering in the way that which we believe. So yeah, she's a murderer.
I don't understand why Patricia Byers just didn't accept that Carl Gotchins was going to leave her and let him leave the country. There was no reason for him to be murdered.
It's a vindictive, calculated crime by a woman who just had one thing in her mind, and that was financial gain.
And murder.
Yes, that's right, and murder.
She knew that the relationship was ending. She couldn't get what she thought she deserved simply by negotiating it with Carl. So she had to kill him. Simple as that.
The idea that Patricia Byers carried out this crime due to greed seems to have some foundation, particularly with the forgeries that have been uncovered in the evidence. It did point towards financial benefit. In that way, it's extremely sad that that's the price of a human life.
Hers is very much a cautionary tale that domestic violence and intimate partner homicide is a very shockingly common occurrence, particularly in Australia, and that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of suburban doors.